Thanks. We have the full committee here today. I know you spoke to us virtually some time ago. Look forward to your summary of your work on design and construction of offshore wind. And as we discussed, 20 minutes is a good time for your talk, and then we'll have plenty of questions. So the floor is yours.
Perfect. And I just put in a bunch of really cool pictures to show to you guys. So now let me try to, you need to give me authorization to share. I just asked for a request.
Oh, you should be good.
Okay, I'm gonna share this screen. Okay, and then if I go over here, you should see my presentation. Boom. And then I just gotta swap display. You guys are here. Excellent. I'm ready to start whenever you guys are.
You're good to start.
Okay, cool. So thank you so much for having me talk to you guys about something that's very dear to me. It's about floating wind. It's a worldwide industry. A little bit of a slowdown in the US right now. I'll talk a little bit about that, but it is very important for our electricity generation worldwide to have all different sources of energy. And so today I'll talk to you about floating offshore wind. Little bit of a background on what is a floating wind turbine. It is first and foremost a hull that is supporting a wind turbine. So the wind turbine is the electricity generation. It's a big turbine, except that instead of burning gas, it uses the wind to spin. As it spins, it creates electricity, and the electricity is transmitted to shore. When we design such systems, the first component is the wind turbine. Traditionally, offshore, there have been three blades. We have a couple of two blades. And when you go offshore, we have this capability to go very, very large. A blade today is around 150 meters. We can transport those onshore, but we can't do it offshore. The tower is part of the turbine scope, and this is really a very critical piece because this is where all the loads coming from the turbine are transmitted into the hull. The fatigue of the tower is really something that we care deeply about. Most of the failures on wind turbines are in blades or in towers. You lose your tower, basically you lose your entire system. The hull is designed to provide buoyancy to the system and motion such that the turbine can operate. The turbine can take a little bit of motion. You can see, when the turbine is very big in heave motion, for example, it's really not a critical motion because the difference in wind at 300 meters and at 10 meters is very different. However, we don't want the structure to pitch and to roll too much because that will create a lot of strange forces on the system. So we can talk more about the design of the floater, and most of the presentations will be based on that. Then we need to transmit the electricity to shore. This is the cable that you see in brown. So the electricity comes from shore to the platform and then to the next platform. Because it's floating, we have a catenary, so it has to take the displacement of the platform. It's the dynamic cable. We use those in oil and gas quite a bit, so there's proven technology there. And then the system is anchored to the seabed through either mooring lines or tendons with anchors ensuring that there's a georeference between the turbine, the entire system, and underground. So basically, this mooring system keeps the platform within a wide radius, and we want to make sure that we design the electrical cable so that it doesn't exceed that radius, so it can play the dynamics. This is how a wind turbine, a very large wind turbine, works. What you have on the graph here is the wind speed, and in this case, the power. So when there's no wind, nothing spins, there's no power. Then as the wind starts building up, you spin as fast as you can, and the more wind, the faster you spin. So the more power you generate. This is between 4 and roughly 10 to 12 meters per second. And then you get to what's called the rated power of the turbine, 2 megawatt, 3 megawatt, 15, 20 megawatt for the latest ones. By the time you get to that wind speed, what we call rated wind power, the more wind there is, you don't want to spin faster because then you'll start burning up some electrical components or things like that. So what you do is you pitch the blades, just like you the wings of an airplane when you put the flaps on and things like that. So you reduce the lift such that you spin at constant speed. So between 12 to about 25 meters per second, so 50 knots, you generate a constant power. And after that, you pitch your blades completely into the wind so they don't generate any lift, and you stop the production. When you're doing a design, what's important is not really the wind speed and the power that you're making, but what is the thrust forces that the turbine puts on the hull, or more specifically, what is the overturning moment at the base of the tower that will drive your system. And what you're saying is that the maximum thrust is not at 25 meters per second, but at 12, because you've actually pitched your blades, so you generate less force even though you go faster. So it's very important to design according to that. And then when you stop, all of a sudden, you don't generate that lift. Your thrust force decreases tremendously, and then it's only a drag system. So the more wind, the more forces. In some cases, the 50-year storm, the design right here, can be lower or higher than this point. So you have to decide for both. If you look, in latitudes that are pretty far north and very big storms, this is one of your driving case. For the project we did, the first project we did in Portugal, this was the driving case because the maximum wind wasn't that big. And then the thing that you have to consider, because you're floating, is when the wind blows on the turbine, just serve out the turbine spin. So in terms of naval architecture, you have a turbine overturning moment, and then your hull has a restoring moment. So you balance it right. What's important for a turbine to make power is you don't want to hurl too much into the wind. If you hurl too much, first it will, if you hurl way too much, it will not work. But the more you hurl, the less power you generate, and the more side loads you get, and so on. So trying to keep your system stable is important. So that's really the anatomy of. No, I don't have. We'll have time for questions, but that's really how the system works. Just a few slides on the market worldwide. Those are all the countries where people are looking into floating offshore wind. Europe is the biggest one. Portugal had the second pilot that we did. UK is probably, and Scotland are the biggest markets right now, with 3 existing projects. I'll show you a couple slides. And Norway as well, with the high wind. France is up and coming, and everybody else is trying to get in. In Asia, Japan has been there for a long time. They stopped a little bit, but they had some projects early on. And Korea is probably the one that's catching up the faster with China. But Korea is more oriented towards European designs. With quite a few projects that are in the Ulsan area. What defines a project for us is important to know. First, you need site control, because if you don't have a site control, you just don't know what you're going to do. And so this is given different ways. In the US, is through a BOEM auction. Then you need consent. That's a UK term. Consent means permits. You need to have all your permits so you can do a project. In the US, we talk about the COP, the plan to how do you develop those, and all your EIAs and so on. Once you have site control and consent, then you need to negotiate the power purchase agreement. This is the cost of how much you're going to sell your electricity for. Once you have all that, and that's usually anywhere between 3 to 10 years, maybe sometimes more, then you can run your COE analysis and you have a project. If the economics are correct, then you can start going into the detail engineering and fabrication and so on. Overall, a project can take anywhere between, I think the fastest we've done was the Windfloat pilot in 3 years, to EFGL that's been installed right now. So for completion, there was a project that was awarded site control in 2016. So 9 years for a project like that. A nuclear power plant in the US is about 10 years. And there are projects that are not in fabrication that have been in the making for quite a long time. So I'll focus just a little bit on the US. What do we have in the US? We have two small demos, one in Maine. It's I think a 350 kilowatt turbine, one in the Gulf Coast with no turbine. So we're quite far behind from the rest of the world in trying to prove technology. We have, in terms of site control, I don't know if you want to say 9 projects or 7 projects. There's 4 projects in Maine that have, with 2 developers, and 5 projects in California. And interest in Hawaii, in Oregon, and in the Gulf of Mexico. The Gulf of Mexico, the BOEM options were cancelled, not delayed, but cancelled. But there is a way to connect to an oil and gas platform, and we'll talk a little bit about that as well. Those are the projects, so quite a bit of power. We'll have to see when those get permitted. So quite a bit behind from everybody else. Just want to show you, I'm just trying to go quickly, I don't want to take too much time, but those are the type of platforms that exist in oil and gas, and those are exactly the same type of platforms that we're seeing back in offshore wind. This is, how do we generate energy out of either the ground or the air, but the floaters are the same. First one that was installed in 2009 is the SPAR from Equinor. It's a single turbine. It's a 2.3 megawatt turbine. So you see here a picture. This is when the turbine was installed offshore using the Saipem 7000 vessel, big oil and gas project. They put the hull directly outside. This is done in the fjord. The platform is very deep. I think it's about 70 meters for this one. So you have to upend it and do the work offshore. But it's a very simple structure, just a pure cylinder. Here you see during the day, and then you tow it to the site. So this is one of the advantages of floating wind. You can install the turbine in a protected area or onshore, and then you just tow to the site. On bottom fixed, you have to install your structure, your jacket or your monopile, bring the turbine to the site. So with big jack-up vessels. And this is the Hywind Scotland project, the 5 turbines. Principal power with the wind float. That's the fabrication of wind float Atlantic. There was 3 units. It was installed in 2019. This is in Lisnave, in Portugal, where I was part of that. Made two of the hull, and this one in Avantia in Spain, where the last hull was made. This is the unit coming out of the yard. This is the Lisnave dry dock. This is one way we fabricated in the yard and then filled up the dry dock and took it out. It's not the most efficient way to do floating wind, but this is a very good way for small projects. Another way to load out, this is what was done in Avantia, is you steer the hull onto a semi-submersible. You go out, you lower the submersible into the, I have another picture where this is lowered. You lower it, the platform floats out, and then you go to a quay, and then you put the turbine at the quay. This is in the north of Spain, where the turbines were assembled and then towed to the site. This is the EFGR project that is being installed as we speak. There's 3 units. The first one just went, so this one actually is being connected to its mooring right now. This is in Port-la-Nouvelle in France. And you see behind the 3 other floaters, those are the ideal floaters for the project that will be installed next year. So talking about ideal, this is a barge type structure. So the first pilot was installed in 2018 in the Atlantic, second pilot in Japan. A year after, that's the one in Japan, you see a 2-bladed turbine. And then Eolmed is the French ADEME project, where I just showed the pictures in the background that will be installed next year. A nice picture. This is a project that was installed 2 years ago in France, the Provence en Large PGL project. Same part of those 3 projects I just talked about was under the same funding. This one is a tension leg platform. So it's not anchored, it's tethered to the seabed. This is the assembly of the hull. Here you see the hull with the buoyancy modules that pull down, so you have ballast in those tubes, and so they put water into it to lower the platform, and they remove the water, hence putting tension on the tendons. And this is, I mentioned, so same thing. It was skid onto this vessel, just like the Windfloat Atlantic one. And then this is a picture when you see the vessel underwater and the platform just floats out. Then same thing, they took it to a quay near Foss and they put the turbine on and towed it to site, and it's installed right now. So this was connected last year. So it was installed 2 years ago, and now it's producing power. A few other demos. On the left side is Fukushima Mirai. This is a 2 megawatt that was installed in Japan in 2013. Yeah, actually it's written up there. And then Stisdal, the Tetraspar. So this is one of the new generations of hulls. So installed in 2021, and then the DemoSat by SciTech installed in 2023. So all demos, none of those companies have pilots. Have commercial projects yet, so everyone's trying to. And then this is the Tetraspar. I just showed you next just a little bit. So, and then this is the SciTech. As an aero architect, I don't understand this one, but they were pretty good at getting funded and getting to the pilot stage. China is coming on very, very strong over the last 2.5 years. They've put in 3 different pilots in the water. They're the ones leading the market with 4 companies providing 15, 18, 20 megawatt turbines. So we're seeing a very, very strong push from China today in Europe, mostly and you read about the Greenvolt project and the issues with the Minial turbine, whether the UK will allow Minial to sell the turbine and operate it. Things about questions about security, data, and so on. But if we want to do this, either we do it ourselves or we have to go to China. So very, very well, it's the same part, it's the same questions everywhere. What do we do with this? A little bit about Osoji. So this is the company personally, I started Principal Power with a person and a couple of friends. We grew this, and then in 2019 we left Principal Power. We wanted to focus more on industrialization, and so we started Osoji with a new floater that's more designed towards the industrialization, being able to put 50 units in one year, so 1 unit per week. How do we get to this? So this is our company. We're based in the US with a big subsidiary in France, and you see the stars of the projects, same plot or same map that I showed. We have two projects, a data buoy that measures the environment. This is to help the permitting and the engineering of the floating wind, and then a new concept that's quite optimized. This is a demo that we are building right now. It's connected. So this is an oil and gas platform that you're seeing in the background. It's Kulin. It's a Total Energy platform. It's 200 miles from Aberdeen. And so this unit is currently in fabrication. It's going to move to Norway in about 3 weeks. So all the pieces will be done, will be assembled in Norway, and we'll put the turbine on. It's a 3 megawatt, and then we'll tow it out to the site. So first time that the pilot is actually connected to an oil and gas platform and that far away from shore. What we're after is really proving the technology, but also proving that we can develop smaller systems to, that cater to a different electrical use than just the grid. And then this was posted. I don't know if you guys are on LinkedIn and looking at offshore wind, but we posted this on Monday. This is the latest project in floating wind that we in feed right now. So in engineering design, it's a 18 megawatt turbine. So it's a Chinese turbine. This is the first time that we'll install something more than a 10 megawatt, very different. This is funded by two Japanese utilities and a German utility. Project will be in the water in 2028. We have a turbine, we have a site, we have funding. So now we just have to, we just have to continue pushing forward and ensure this is done. In terms of size, what's very interesting is the blade is 125 meters. Actually, now it's a little bit more than this. But yeah, about 125 meters. So the diagonal of a football field for blade. The nacelle is 1,000 ton. The mast is a little bit over 1,000 ton. The tower is 135 meters, but our structure is 38,000 tons. So that's very small compared to what else is happening. I talked about the site control. So we are in feed. Next year's detailed design. 2027 is we fabricate. So that's my 20 minutes. Sorry, I went fast. But I was trying to get you a quick summary.
Okay, well, thank you, Dominique. As we think about questions, I'll lead off with a couple. First, this 18 megawatt project that you're about to embark upon or have been working on, how many turbines will be installed?
This is just one.
Just one, and so it's a pilot.
Actually, it's a pilot. It's a pilot, and the reason for that is on all. The biggest thing about a new industry like this is we have on those projects we have to finance them. So how do you bank finance, a 500 megawatt project? With new technologies, new turbines, and big risk. And so you have to show that the turbine can spin. I think we've done that over the years, except we've never done it with a turbine that size. And then you have to look at your cost, and you have to look at the risk. What is the risk that there's an issue with the turbine? And then that you have to take the turbine to shore and things like that, and then you're starting to lose revenue. And the best way to do that is to start getting operational experience on those projects. So today, this turbine is the leading turbine in for floating wind. The Greenvolt project, 500 megawatt, is using that turbine. They're coming after. There's a few other projects we are involved in that are also using that turbine and similar. So we believe, and the consortium partners as well, that to be able to bank finance larger projects, we have to stay in the pilot stage a little bit longer. No one wants to do pilots. That's just something that we have to do to get to commercial.
Okay, good. And what, it's maximum rated at 18 megawatt. What will be the average capacity that you get out of an installation like this? Taking into account, changes in wind and maybe downtime of the turbine. What's the prediction for
the capacity factor depends on the sites you're in. So you have, average wind speed and capacity factor are very linked together. But not exactly. In Norway, the capacity factor is about 60%. In Portugal, we were topping 40%, just less wind. In the Med, this is a no wind or a lot of wind. But we're also seeing capacity factors offshore in the 45 to 50%. In terms of wind speed average, which translates, 10 meters per second is a very, very good site. We can do projects anywhere between 8 and 9, and then lower is difficult. But again, then you also have to look at, what is the biggest storms that you're going to see. If you're up in, above Scotland, where there's a lot of oil and gas in the Shetlands, you get your maximum HS is 17, 18 meters. If you're in the Med, you're at 12. So not the same structure. But at the end of the day, the better site, especially for the big units, even if you have big waves, if you're going to install something in 25 years, if you have big waves, you have a bigger, stronger, heavier structure, more expensive, but you'll generate a lot more power. So, between a site in Italy and where the winds are very low, and so are the waves, and a site in Scotland, Scotland winds. So then your
Yeah.
tariff, basically what it means is your tariff, when you look at, we talked about PPAs, when you look at the cost for the PPAs, they're higher, your electricity price is higher in Italy than it would be in Scotland for offshore wind. Same in California, you have a big difference between Humboldt Bay and Morro Bay. So we'll see, and Oregon as well. So we'll see what PPAs, what projects make sense.
Yeah, what would be your expectation, Dominique, for the West Coast, California, Oregon, Washington?
I think those projects will happen. I just hope I'm still around when they happen. I think the US, we this is kind of something that we do. We're behind and we leapfrog everybody. Then we're behind and we leapfrog everybody. It's really too. What's happening right now is really too bad for offshore wind, because it is something that is doable technically very well. It is a political issue and not a technical issue when those projects will happen.
And I have one other question. You alluded to the fact that the nacelles are primarily manufactured in China. Are there any other companies manufacturing these turbines?
For the 15 plus, there are two, well, there were three, but one is slowing down. European companies, Siemens, Vestas, and GE. Siemens is the only one that is still a little bit involved in floating. Vestas is playing around. They have a full pipeline of bottom fixed projects. So right now they're kind of slowing down, and the Chinese are just using this to come in very, very strongly. We talked about, Menial, you have Goldwing that's installed an entire research company in Denmark. Menial is installed in Paris. There's Dafeng and so on. So right now, if we want to do projects, they're the ones selling turbines. So that's how, that's what we have to work with.
Okay, good. Mike Conway has a question. Mike?
Yeah, hi, thanks, Dominique. I enjoyed the presentation. I just wanted to ask, there's a question in chat that I think is pretty relevant. It's from Delia from Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife. It is, could you discuss your experiences with the pilot installations and interactions with fishing gear and how you dealt with them? And did your projects require fishing closures? And how did you plan for that during siting, installation, and operation? And I know maybe not closures, but were fisheries able to operate in and around those floating turbines, assuming that they were connected via inter-array cables, or maybe they weren't connected with inter-array cables?
Yeah, so the first pilot that we did have to deal with fishermen. We were on a site called the Edusadora, where there was a wave energy site, there was a substation and so on. The fishermen were pretty open to working with us. I think a lot of it is about communication. We worked on a project with Principal Power in Oregon, where we started getting a lot of pushback early on with the fishermen. And then, they came in, we were doing some model tests, we started talking, and I said, look, it's a lot of it is about, communication and using the vessels. There are a few things that they cannot do. It's not for us, it's for them, really, they cannot troll. One of the reason is you hook your gear into a cable or an anchor. You're not going to damage the cable, you're not going to damage the anchor, you're going to capsize your boat if you don't stop your winch. And that's a safety issue. And they get that. And at the end of the day, it's all about, sharing the space. In Hawaii, very long years of discussions with the US Navy, and it just stops. We're trying to do a project near Pearl Harbor, and we had all submarine captains on board 10 years somethings, and then we're talking to the active ones, and then at one point they go, it's classified, and then that's the end. Everybody shuts up. It's really strange. And then you move on to the next one on the agenda. Okay, let's go somewhere else. So we got California, same thing. Most of the coast has military uses. We just have to figure out where to go. The thing about floating is we can go further away. We can be 50, 60 kilometers from shore. Okay, it's slightly longer cable, doesn't work for a pilot, but it works for a large commercial ride. We've got projects, bottom fixed project in the North Sea, 200 kilometers from Germany. Okay, you go to DC line and so on. So and the work that we do with the OCG data is also, we're working on experimental fishing techniques. What can you do? What can you not do? And so on. Finally, I think, you can have large, when you design your systems, you can have large corridors for vessels to go through. So they don't have to go around the farm, which, takes time and fuel. So I think it's, there's a lot of work that's being done. Further, we're doing also some work with a lot of companies about increasing, if you don't fish in an area, you can use this area and, the structure will kind of act like artificial reefs, floating, so you can actually have species just developing. And if you fish around them, I mean, the fish doesn't know, okay, I'm protected, I'm not protected, there's no wall, there's no, it's an open water. So you can fish on the outside. So a lot of work, we've looked on the buoy that we installed in, we tied there was some sea brine that were tied in Spain and off the coast, and then they were picked up 15 kilometers from shore. So they do travel back and forth. So, there's a lot of work that can be done to work with fishermen. And if you have, the other thing is, if you have, those big farms in there, you have data, so you can actually track some of the fish and give that information and so on. So a lot of high-tech stuff that can be done with fishing groups.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, and personally, I would say personally, I've never had issues with fishermen, talking to them about what we're doing and what they're doing. So it's just about listening also to what they want to do and what they're doing.
Right, thank you. Next question, David, Checkley, you question.
Yeah, thank you, Dominic. Excellent. I'm curious about the variability temporally in capacity or performance in relation to wind, which has sort of 10 to 100 kilometer scale or more variability in events, 7 days, 10 days. I'm just curious what the performance looks like over time. Is it in your experience?
With your wind predictions, I mean, how much wind you're going to have, fairly accurately, 3-4 days before, and very, very accurately, 2 or 3 hours. So floating wind or offshore wind, it's part of the energy mix. Whether you make it primary or secondary is really a function of what is your alternative source. If you're running, big power plant that you can shut down, then okay, second, you have to manage your grid. But so in Humboldt Bay, for example, the power plant, it's a gas plant. Instead of being a 100 megawatt gas plant, it's 10 megawatt gas plants. So you can always manage if and you can always build your gas plants in that fashion, where you know how much you are, and you adapt your gas loads to your wind resource locally. And then the other thing you have to look at is kind of like everyone's talking about the super grid. So what if you have solar and sun, and how do all those mix, and electricity can move back and forth a lot faster. You all know the duck curve in California, and from solar, and then when you start adding everything, then it becomes pretty much matching pretty much flat when you take the balance between the generation and the demand, but really matching the generation can really match the demand. When the sun goes down, the wind picks up, and so between sun and solar, you're good, and then you can use gas to balance the rest.
Thank you. One other question, if I could just, any experience with seabirds?
Yes, lots. I don't know what's the political correct answer to this. I think that people focus a little bit too much on wind turbine killing birds, and buildings kill birds, cats kill birds, but we talk about curtailment and so on. But again, so that's a matter of fact. We have to be careful. There was a bald eagle that was killed by an onshore turbine 10 years ago. It was on YouTube, and it laid back the US probably a year on those. So having said that, what do we do? So right now we're moving our little buoy that I didn't talk too much about, but we're moving that to one of the sites in France. We have a bird radar on it. We're going to we've looked this year at the migration patterns. We look at image recognition compared to a radar. So you have a bird radar, so it works in 3D, tells you when the birds are coming, and then you can look at those. If they're endangered species, then you can take action. You can slow down your turbines and so on. Today, there's not enough technology done. People say, okay, so this is a migration pattern, shut down for 3 months or 3 weeks. That's not really doable when you're trying to generate electricity for your country. But there are things that can be done to protect that. There's mitigation devices. There's things you don't want to disrupt, so you don't want to play, large sounds. You can. Sounds work great on like Tobu, that's what we do. But at the large scales, you can't. But you can understand when are the migration patterns coming. I learned a lot this year. Birds come back exactly, different in those migrations, different species fly one after the other on the same place where they went through within a month and a half period. So knowing all this is you can do things for curtailment to protect those species. So again, I mean, it's just how do we work together with the birds and make sure that we don't kill too many of them, and how do we work with fishermen, and how do we generate electricity for ourselves?
Thank you.
Okay, next question, Brian.
Great presentation, and thanks so much again. Just a quick question for you. How should we think about scaling up from the relatively few number, like 2, 3 turbine to much larger configurations? What would you have us think about how that's different from a singular 2, 3 size array?
So this is what's going on in Europe right now. The next round of projects are going to be about 100 to 200 megawatt projects. So in the UK, there's going to be what's called around 7. There's going to be one project that's bidding. It's a 50 megawatt project. One is 100 megawatt. One is a 200 megawatt, and another one's 100 megawatt. So all those projects will win the CFD round, so the contract for this is the PPA contract for difference, but there will be at least 2 or 3 at the 100 megawatt scale. We personally are really looking forward to those projects, because this is when we build, instead of building one, we build 5 or 10. So now we can start looking at, okay, so we have 10 turbines. We say we want to do 50 in 1 year. That means that we've got to start installing stuff in the winter. We gotta go faster in the summer, and we're going to start understanding those methodologies and reducing the risk, so that when we do a 500 megawatt project is like 2 or 3 billion of investment. So you're not gonna do 2 or 3 billion of investment if you haven't done 500 million. So you have to get that intermediate step. In the US, it's nowhere in the plan to do anything like that. So in the US, we're gonna have to wait until those projects are done in Europe, or to de-risk the technology, to de-risk not the technologies, but to de-risk the project execution of a small project. But we are waiting anyway. So.
Hey, Jeremy.
Yeah, thanks for being with us today. So can you say a little bit about the depths that the floating arrays have been installed to date? And then, make a comparison to the depths off the West Coast, and what that might mean in terms of both the mooring lines and the cables, and how that may differ on the effects to both fishing, and the navigation.
Yeah, so most of the pilots have been installed in anywhere for floating. The sweet spot is 200 meters, 150 to 200 meters. Most of the projects were closer to shore, so they were installed in less than that, 70, 80 meters. This is kind of a little slide on what does the mooring system looks like. So you have an anchor, I guess I can show it here. Then some chain, heavy chain, things with clump weights, so you can go up and down. A little bit more chain, then polyester, and then you connect to the seabed. You design all this such that in your maximum 100-year storm, 50-year storm, everything pulls out of the water up to about this point, and your anchor stays in. The way you set those anchors, so they're called drag embedment anchors, is you pull on them from the vessels until they go into the seabed, and you pull and you hold that load for 15 minutes. So the anchor drops down into the seabed to about 8 to 12 meters, and then slowly it comes out. But you know it just doesn't move on the largest loads, so you keep your watch cycle. And answer your question about entertainment. When you're going into deep water, it's a lot simpler. You just have, you know, either a suction pile or a driven pile or something, some chain, and then just polyester. The reason it's simpler is because the elasticity of the polyester is such that, you know, if you have to move 10 meters and you get 100 meters of line, you're trying to get to 10% of your displacement. If you have 700 meters of line, then you're down to 2% of your displacement. So, you know, it's a lot simpler to do deep water. In the Gulf of Mexico, I think we've drilled in 10 kilometers of water for wells. I think that the deepest platform is in 8 or 9,000 meters, give or take. So anchoring things in 700 meters of water is very, you know, it's common practice for the industry. The other thing that I'll say is your polyester rope has a net buoyancy very, very close to 1. So it doesn't really, the weight, there's no weight in that rope when it's in the water, so it doesn't really affect the hull. Having said that, you do have stuff in the water. You have your mooring lines, they're pretty well documented where you are when you see the platform. You have your inter-array cable that are going around. So you have to be careful. But, you know, it's the same when you look at, you know, first platform, I worked for Exxon when I started my career on the platform, you know, Genesis and Diana, they were Chevron and Exxon platform, 24 mooring lines. And I don't remember how much on the other ones, and some were failing, so you do have to replace. You know, it's kind of the, you know, one platform with 24 mooring lines, or, you know, 6 platforms with 7 platforms, 8 platforms with 3 mooring lines. It's about the same number of mooring lines. So you have to, you know, you have to, yeah, you have to understand how that's done, and they don't move, you know, in the water. You know what they are. You know, they can be marked on the maps, and when you come in with your boats and your GPS, and you know, those platforms, they will have an AIS system, so you see them, and so you just stay away. That's what you have to do. So yes, you know, those spaces, you know, from the that we're using, they have to be restricted in some fashion. But again, you know, those everything is pretty low into the seabed.
One last question, Dominique. You showed 4 different structures, I think, TLP, a spar, a semi-sub, a barge. Is one type becoming dominant in the industry, or can we expect one of these to emerge as the preferred arrangement?
Yes, and it's very easy to understand why. When you have when you're in oil and gas and you have a riser and you want to wet, you want a dry tree, so meaning that the head of your well is at the platform, so you have, you know, control access of your well. You don't want to move vertically. And so if you don't want to move vertically, because then, you know, you just don't have, you know, your riser is a steel pipe, right? You have to have a platform that has no heave. So those are the spars and the TRPs. Why the spars? Because the wave exciting force is what happens on the bottom of the spar. In this case, it's very deep and it's very small. On the TLP, you have very little motions because your stability comes from the fact that your tendons are under tension. So they compensate the first order loads, what's coming directly from the wave. So those are excellent platforms for dry trees. The semi-sub is a wet tree platform, meaning you have a flexible riser that goes to the seabed, and the control of the well is on the seabed. Cheaper, but some restrictions on vertical motion. In floating wind, you have absolutely no requirement on the heave motion because your wind is very different at 10 meters than it is at 300 meters. So you already have taken this shift, and the turbines are meant for that. What you don't want is pitch and roll, but mostly pitch. So it's the rotation platform. The semi-submersible is wider, so you get more stability. It's kind of like a catamaran versus a sailboat. Your catamaran is much better. So what we're saying is it's a cheaper floater that has the right motion characteristics for floating wind. So this is why you see that most of the new designs are semi-sub. Originally, we put the turbine on one side. This was because the cranes couldn't reach the middle because the turbines were too small. 2 megawatts, so the wind float one. This is why we had the chips, because the turbine the hull was at quayside, and we had to put the turbine on, so with a small crane. Today, the turbines are so big and so tall that the crane is just as big as tall. So if you just do the cosine of the angle, the 35 meters takes you to go to the center is taken by the cosine of that angle. So column towers getting back in the middle, which simplifies everything in terms of hydrodynamics and motions. And further apart means more stable. So that's what we're saying. You can have, spars are only good in Norway, in fjords, because we want to install the turbine at the site. So for Utsira, we'll propose a spar, but that's really specific to fjords. And tension leg platforms, you're paying much more than you need for something that's not at the end of it's an economics problem. If you don't need the stability, you don't have to pay for those big offshore operations. So
Okay, very good. Thank you, Dominique, for this and your prior talk. Much appreciated.
all right, thank you so much. You guys enjoy the rest of your day.
I think. Oh, okay. Our next speaker will talk on hydrodynamic and upwelling impacts. Michael Jaycox from NOAA Fisheries. Welcome, Michael. The floor is yours.
Thanks very much. You hear me okay?
Very good.
Great. And do you see full screen? Yeah. Okay, great. Okay, thanks for having me. Yes, I'm going to talk a bit about some modeling exercises to look at the potential impacts of these offshore wind installations on the West Coast on ocean circulation and the productivity of the ecosystem. Just quickly, the project team. I'm from NOAA Fisheries, based in Monterey, California, working with folks from UC Santa Cruz, Integral Consulting, and Sandia National Labs. This particular project is an interagency agreement between NOAA and BOEM. And so Tom Kilpatrick is our point of contact there. And one of the team members, Kaus, I believe, is on the line. Has done a lot of work in this space and can probably help with answering questions as well. Okay, so to set the stage for this study, there are, of course, lots of potential impacts of offshore wind development on the marine environment and on marine species. Here's one summary of potential effects, from sort of physical effects through to electromagnetic fields and noise. And for this study, we're focusing on this part here. So we're not focusing on the impact of the structures in the water or the cables or any of that, but really on the alteration of the winds by the turbines, and then subsequently what that means for the oceanography. And in the California current system, we're particularly interested because it is this coastal upwelling system. The huge productivity and diversity of the ecosystem and the fisheries and other human uses that it supports are ultimately all derived from this coastal upwelling process and the nutrients it supplies. And so this project is building on prior work in this space. So KAUS led an earlier project funded by the California Energy Commission. And the takeaway here was this was really focusing on the physical upwelling changes. And in the lee of simulated wind farms for Morro Bay and Diablo Canyon at the time, we could see this wind wake and associated with it this change in the spatial structure of upwelling. So on the right here, just highlighted these purple and green areas where closer to shore you have this decreased upwelling, and farther from shore you have increased upwelling, such that the total is little changed, if at all, but that the spatial structure is changing. And so this raised questions about what might the impacts be of these physical changes on the ecosystem. There's also been work elsewhere here from the North Sea doing some similar work looking at the potential impacts of wind farms with ocean and biogeochemical models. And this middle panel here in the greens and blues is showing changes in net primary productivity. I think, my personal feeling is that this work is suggestive, but I have some questions about the robustness of how some of these studies have been done in terms of teasing apart signal from noise, especially when you see these very, very noisy impacts. So I think we have to be careful to make sure that these are robust changes associated with the wind farms. So with that as motivation, we have two primary goals with this project. One is, as I said, to understand what the impacts of the wind farms might be on the coastal circulation and biogeochemistry, so particularly the nutrient supply and productivity, and then also to contextualize those changes with climate change. And the way we're doing that here, I'll get to at the end briefly, is simply to compare the magnitude of impacts we're seeing, or the magnitude and the nature of impacts we're seeing from offshore wind with those expected under climate change. All right, so focusing on this first piece, and bear with me, just walking through some of the details of how we're doing this. You can just focus on the left here where it says baseline model. So we have a series of models linked together to look at the impacts we're interested in. There's an atmospheric model, and I'll unpack each of these a little bit in the coming slides. There's an atmospheric model where we're able to represent the wind farms. We run that atmospheric model, and then we use the output from that to drive an ocean model. And the ocean model is coupled to a biogeochemical model. So from those two together, we can look at nutrients, oxygen, phytoplankton, zooplankton, coastal circulation, things like that. And then on the right, the only difference is that in the baseline, we have no turbines. And then on the right, in the turbine configurations, we add in these turbines into the atmospheric model that will alter the wind fields. And then we can use those altered wind fields to drive the ocean model. So to look a little more in detail at the atmospheric model, this is showing the spatial coverage. You can see the wind energy areas that we're now looking at, Coos Bay, Brookings, Humboldt, and Morro Bay. We are doing build-outs with 15 and 20 megawatt turbines. The whole domain is run at 3-kilometer resolution for about 25 years. And I will note that obviously 3-kilometer resolution is bigger, is coarser than the scale of an individual wind turbine. So the individual turbines are parameterized in the model. They're not explicitly represented individually. But the 3-kilometer scale is fine enough for us to resolve the impacts on the oceanography. This is just a little more detail on the wind energy areas, which I'm sure everyone is familiar with. But of note, relative to that prior California Energy Commission study, we've obviously updated the wind energy areas. That study was using the Humboldt and Morro Bay areas, but also this Diablo Canyon one. And we're using larger turbines now, we're simulating larger turbines, and with our updated understanding of the spacing of the turbines. So the ocean model that is being driven is the ROMS, Regional Ocean Modeling System, coupled to this biogeochemical model. Again, like the winds, 3-kilometer resolution for 25 years. And like I said, we can get the biogeochemistry out of here. So I'll run through what we have. I'll say that this project is in progress, and I'm going to show some very hot off the press results. But we'll walk through changes from the winds through to plankton. All right, so just summarizing what we see in the wind speed on the left here, you can see the mean wind speed in this baseline case with no turbines. And then in the middle panel, the difference once you build out all these areas with 15 megawatt turbines. And so those patches of blue downstream of the turbines are the wind wakes where energy has been removed from the atmosphere, and there are these wind speed reductions. The Morro Bay one obviously being the most prominent. And on the right, I'm just showing the seasonal cycle of the winds at the locations within each of those 4 wind wakes. The solid lines being the baseline case, and then the dashed and dotted lines with 15 and 20 megawatt turbines. Again, the Morro Bay is where we see the strongest impacts of the wind wake. And also of interest, I think, is that the wind speed reductions in the 20 megawatt case are actually less than in the 15 megawatt case. And we think this is due to the size of the 20 megawatt turbines, where ultimately you're actually able to extract less energy with the wind farm layouts that we have, because you have fewer turbines despite them being bigger. All right, so I'm going to move into the oceanography now, and I'll walk through about 4 plots that look like this, moving from the physics to the biology. So for each of them, I'm plotting the baseline case again on the left and the change on the right. Just for the sake of consolidating the results, I'm showing the average of the 15 and 20 megawatt simulations, which also helps us look for impacts that are consistent across the two. And then I'm focused here for these results on the upwelling season, which I'm approximating as March to July. But of course, we can look at this for the whole year or other seasons. So here for upwelling is most intense right along the coast. Tends to decay as you go offshore, although there are some regions like in the Southern California Bight where there's significant upwelling offshore. And then when you look at the changes, if you look down in the Morro Bay area, you see a similar pattern to what we showed from Kaus's paper earlier, where you get this reduction of upwelling on the inshore side of that wind wake and an increase in upwelling on the offshore side. And you can see similar impacts at the northern areas as well, though less pronounced. So this is this index, QT, Coastal Upwelling Transport Index, is physically how much water is coming up from below into the surface. But what really drives the biology, of course, is not just how much water is coming up, but how much nutrient is coming up. So that's what this metric is. It's the supply of nitrate, which tends to be the limiting nutrient, into the surface layer from below. And you see a very similar pattern, so as you did for just the physical transport. So we get these pretty big changes in the spatial structure of the nutrient supply, especially downstream of that Morro Bay wind farm. Okay, so I think the big question coming out of this is, what does it mean for the productivity? So first I'm showing the biomass of phytoplankton, so really the base of the food web. And these changes on the right, well, I guess starting on the left again, plankton concentrations, phytoplankton concentrations are highest near shore and decay as you go offshore. They're associated with that strong upwelling nutrient supply near shore. But the changes you see are certainly noisy. Gets to my point of, I think you need to have, long runs to separate signal from noise. But the changes that really jump out are, again, most pronounced around the Morro Bay area, although there are some suggestive signals farther north. And you really get this increase in plankton biomass immediately to the west of the wind farm, and then a decrease sort of to the south. And these changes are of the order of 20%. And we're averaging, again, across 25 years here. So these are sort of long-term changes. When you look at zooplankton, you get a similar pattern, which is not surprising that they're going to respond to the availability of phytoplankton. But this similar sort of dipole of increase west of the farm and then decrease to the south. And I'll also say, just for those more familiar with sort of the ecological dynamics that associated with these changes in the total phytoplankton or total zooplankton abundance are also changes in the community composition. So in areas where we're seeing more phytoplankton, we're also seeing a shift to larger phytoplankton and larger zooplankton. And same in the areas with decreased productivity, we're seeing a smaller community of plankton and zooplankton. All right, so this sort of a summary of the effects. Again, we're seeing the largest effects to the south here near Morro Bay, where you have these spatially nuanced changes in the upwelling and the nitrate supply, and then subsequently these changes in the primary and secondary production that are not really intuitive in terms of their spatial pattern. It's not just the area where there's less upwelling has less productivity, the area where there's more has more productivity. It's a little more nuanced than that. And so we want to understand that. And the working hypothesis is that this is not a static system. So once there's a nutrient supply into the system, there is time, takes time for the biological communities to respond. And as they do respond, there's also currents advecting them through the system. So here's a schematic idea of what's going on, that you have these areas outlined in purple of positive and negative changes to the nitrate supply. And then you have this sort of advection offshore and to the south. And so when you see the plankton responses, you're seeing them displaced from where the upwelling changes were. And where the sort of overlap of these areas of influence is, you might not see much of a change in the plankton communities, but then where the influence of either the increase or the decreased nitrate dominates, you would see changes in the plankton communities. So we've actually started to dig into this hypothesis a bit, and one way we can do that is with particle tracking. I'll show you some very new and preliminary work, but if we focus in on these areas, we're getting more or less nitrate supply, and we can seed particles, basically release particles in that area and see where they go. So here, putting a bunch of particles into the area where the nitrate supply is decreased and seeing where it goes over the course of 10 days. And this plot in the middle top shows the distribution of those particles after 10 days. We can do the same thing from the area that's getting an increased nitrate supply. And then by looking at the difference between these, we can see what areas are influenced relatively more or less. And so that's what this is here. And so basically you can think of the blue as being areas that are more influenced by that decreased nitrate source, and red being more influenced by the increased nitrate source. And comparing with our plankton changes, this is certainly suggestive that at least this working hypothesis might hold weight in terms of reproducing the patterns that we're seeing, where the changes in productivity are displaced from the upwelling changes in a reasonable way. So that's sort of a summary of what we're seeing in terms of changes in productivity of order 20% changes, more pronounced in the south and with this spatial pattern offshore. All right, so then I want to talk quickly about the second part of this project of comparing these changes with what we might expect from long-term climate change. And here we're drawing on past work on projected climate impacts. So this is one paper where I'm summarizing the things we just looked at. This strength of upwelling, which is that first index QD, beauty being the nitrate supply, and then the phytoplankton biomass on the right. This is looking at changes between early 20th century and late 20th century under a high emissions scenario. And the three different colors are just three different models, which are giving us some measure of the uncertainty in these projections. But if you look at the upwelling, you're seeing some changes of order up to 20% in the far north and far south of the California current system. The nitrate supply, you're seeing decreases almost everywhere, reaching up to, say, 50% in the Southern California current system. And then the phytoplankton biomass, similarly, we're seeing projected decreases almost everywhere of order 10 to 20%. It's worth noting that for these changes, we're not looking at them in the same sort of spatially explicit way, although I will show that in a second. But this is for a coastal band, that coastal band where productivity is greatest, within 75 kilometers of shore. If we look at this spatially, on the left here with the green color bar is a historical sort of baseline estimate of chlorophyll, but you can just think of this again as phytoplankton biomass. And then the next three panels are the projected changes from three different models. So they range from very little change in one model to a pretty dramatic change in the far right, where those nearshore changes might be nearing 50% reduction in phytoplankton biomass. So just, again, this is sort of a semi-quantitative, largely qualitative comparison between the two to contextualize the wind farm changes. But just some takeaways that I would offer from those comparisons are that, one, the wind farm impacts are really patchy, and they are positive and negative. If you looked across the whole system, I don't think you'd see much in terms of a net positive or negative impact on the productivity or upwelling for that matter. And so it's really this spatial pattern that's changing and what might be the impacts of that. And interestingly, those spatial patterns you're seeing have no natural analogs. Like, you can't find times where you naturally get alterations of the upwelling patterns that look like what the wind farms drive. I really focused on the southern area because the signals are much harder to discern in the north. I think that's partly because they are smaller wind farms with fewer turbines, but also because of the interactions between them. I think it makes it harder to distill the impacts of a single wind farm. The biggest impacts under the sort of climate change scenarios are right next to the coast. And in that really narrow sort of coastal band of highest productivity, the wind farm impacts are much less than the projected climate change impacts. But offshore, again, where we see those 20% simulated changes from the wind farms, then the two can be comparable. And again, this is under a high emissions scenario. And it's probably safe to say that under lower emissions scenario, in the climate projections, you will get qualitatively the same trends, but of lower magnitude. And then lastly, I think a really interesting piece of contextualizing wind farms with climate change impacts is that presumably a greener future with more wind farms means lower emissions. And so if under the scenario I've shown now, where we build out a couple wind farms and have high emissions, the climate change impacts look greater, they will converge as you get to a space where emissions are lower and wind farm impacts are higher. And I'll stop there for discussion.
Yeah, thank you very much. A fascinating study for sure. And Let's see, I'm sure we'll have plenty of questions. We'll start with, Dave Checker.
Hi, Mike. Thank you very much. Excellent, predictably. Curious about two things. One is oxygen and the other is fish. You went as high as zooplankton and, but I'm just curious your thoughts on both of those.
Yeah, okay, so I can start with oxygen. I think that since the impacts are not primarily over the shelf, that like I don't think we're going to see big impacts in bottom oxygen. But in terms of the sort of upper ocean oxygen, you know, it will track nitrate pretty well. So in areas where we're seeing the increased nitrate supply, we'll probably see a little bit lower oxygen, although I'm not sure it's going to be biologically important. The fish is, of course, we did the first study and it was like, all right, what does this mean for productivity? And now, of course, the question is, all right, great, phytoplankton, zooplankton, what does it mean for fish? And I just have to, invoke well, people like you, honestly, I would turn that question back to you and think about what you think this might mean for CPS or other species. But also bring in folks like Owen and Jamil who talked yesterday and Kelly Andrews. And I think that's absolutely somewhere this has to go. Anything I say would be certainly speculative. But I think there are either from sort of an expert opinion approach, which someone like you could probably offer on the spot, to more mechanistic modeling, we could look at what the impacts of this level of productivity change might mean.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Next question, Mike Conley.
Yeah, hi, Mike. Thanks. Appreciate the presentation. When you were modeling, did you look at just the 5 California leases, or did you also take into consideration California's long-term goal, which would be 5 times as much? And, based upon maps that we've seen, we primarily located between Mendocino and the North Coast. And if you didn't, would you expect that to change some of your thought process on the impacts of wind at that scale on upwelling and productivity?
Yeah. So in the earlier project towards the end, we did run some simulations with additional area like Mendocino built out and stuff like that, and more consistent with the California goals. In this project, where we're actually looking at the productivity changes, we haven't. And I think I don't know if Tom Kilpatrick's actually on the call, but it's an interesting discussion to have, because I think BOEM is really interested in the areas that they've identified, right? And so timing wise, this is always a bit of a struggle to me, where the science we're sort of, there's a big push to do the science on areas that have been identified, but then of course we're always going to be behind the curve in sort of understanding the names or being able to inform siting, for example. We'll always be looking at the potential impacts of chosen sites as opposed to informing siting. In terms of what we would see, I don't really know, except to say that I think it would be messier. Even just like going from where we had the Morro Bay and Diablo areas to just Morro Bay, it's easier to discern what the impact is. So I think when you get this whole patchwork of wind farms interacting with each other, that it's tough to tease out what's going on.
No, and that's, as you know, been one of the things that we've been hammering on, right? Like it's somewhat easier, right, to identify potential impacts from the 2 leases off Humboldt and the 3 off of Morro Bay. But then when you look at California's long-term planning goals, do you look at what DOE has talked about in terms of transmission study, right, and what their vision is for how much is being generated? It's just, trying to figure that out beforehand and accounting for that today when we don't really do it that way is something that we're certainly struggling with. So thanks.
I do think a really interesting thing is that, again, we're not seeing like you get a wind farm and then you just like broad scale reduce productivity or increase it, right? It's these spatial shifts. So as you scale up in terms of the total amount of energy, you could imagine a case where, okay, one wind farm reduces the productivity and so 10 will reduce it more, but it seems to be much more nuanced than that.
Yeah, it's not a linear, not a linear thing.
Yeah.
All right, thanks, appreciate it.
Thank you.
This Keith, Michelle, I'm gonna jump in with a question because it follows on with Michael's question, and that's you found the most effect in the Morro Bay, Diablo Canyon area, and if you look at the two of those together, it's a very large northwesterly coverage, which is the primary direction of the wind. And I was wondering, did you also analyze one of Morro Bay only without Diablo Canyon to see how much the size is impacting the upwell?
Yeah, so in this new study, we're not including Diablo Canyon at all because now we know it's off the table, whereas the earlier one, it was still under consideration. But in the earlier study, we did look at cases with both. Kaus might have this at the front of his mind. Qualitatively, certainly the impacts on upwelling were very similar, with some small quantitative differences.
Yeah. I mean, we did one study with the 12 megawatt turbines for the Morro Bay 376 area alone. And Mike is right that we did find very similar like qualitative changes, but with small shifts like in the magnitude. But generally, yes, the changes were consistent with what Mike is showing.
Okay, good. All right, thank you. Next question is Robert.
Thanks for the presentation. It was really fascinating. I had some questions about the modeling of the turbines themselves. And I understand you said you didn't actually model individual turbines, but a wind farm in total. What exactly are you representing in your model as the turbines? Are they strictly just a physical impediment to the wind field, or are these, extracting energy from the wind? What is it that you're actually modeling? If you can summarize that in a reasonable.
Yeah, they're extracting momentum and generating turbulence.
Okay. And are you assuming that these are running 24/7 full bore for 25 years, or are you accounting for capacity factors where they're not actually productive for that full amount of time?
Kaus, you're muted. Are you asking just about like the curve relative to the wind speed, or are you talking about downtime for like maintenance and things like that as well?
All of the above.
Okay.
Right. It's not constantly pulling energy out of the system, right? It's not always running, right? Or it's running, well, let's say 50% of the time. Is that something you accounted for or not?
Go ahead, Kaus.
Yeah, so the turbines do have like a power rating, as Mike just alluded to, and the power extraction is governed by this power rating. The turbines do have like a cut-in speed and a cut-out speed, and the cut-out speed is I want to say about 12 meters per second, above which the turbines kind of go into a shutdown mode, which is captured in the power curve.
But we don't build in any sort of maintenance downtime or something like that. So as long as, in the model, they would just be running as the winds allow, basically.
Got it. Okay, thank you.
All right, next question, Michelle.
Thanks. I have a few questions. Thanks for the presentation. My first question is, you mentioned that you basically had two different scenarios, one where you were drawing on past data and another that was looking at high emissions, climate change effects. And I was wondering on the past data, did that include like the presence of offshore marine heat waves or how the PDO may not be as effective, relative to predictions of upwelling?
Yeah, so for the wind farm simulations, we're using realistic conditions from 1995 to 2020. So over that 25 period, you would absolutely get marine heat waves, you get oscillations in the PDO, all of the natural variability that you'd expect to see off the West Coast. And then in the future climate scenarios, you of course have all of that stuff in addition to the long-term trends.
Okay, but like where we've been seeing the presence of offshore marine heat waves kind of more persistent and more regular, if you will. Well, I mean, we've had one, I think, right, for the last 4 years or something that's been constant. So is that factored in?
Yeah, the model would capture that. The historical, yeah, that 95 to 2020 run, it has realistic variability. So yeah, like the 2015 and 2019, these big marine heat waves are in there.
Okay, and so is that the that produced the output of the average of 20% reduction over the long term?
Well, the 20% reduction is what you get when you take the difference. So basically we have like one run that's just those 25 years, realistically what actually happened. And then a similar run where everything is the same except we've added in the wind farms. And so we're simulating what those 25 years would have looked like if you added in the wind farms. And so the 20% is the difference between those two. It's what's there's, you still have the heat waves and all that stuff, but that difference is the result of adding in the simulated wind farms.
Okay. And then you had also talked about how if the wind farms were placed further offshore, like so the closer to shore is where you're going to have effects on upwelling. And I just wondered if there was like a specific distance from shore, or are there areas that could still be efficient for wind further offshore, but may have maybe minimal disruption to upwelling?
Yeah, oh yeah. I mean, I think it would be that at some point it would be the technological limitations there, because there's definitely wind farther offshore, and as you get farther offshore, altering the upwelling is going to matter less. So, I mean, putting these things right near the coast, that's where the coastal upwelling is strongest and is sort of most important for productivity. And then, yeah, the farther you go offshore, sort of the less that impact would be.
But do you know what that is? So like, is there a break point of where if you're, for example, 10 miles offshore, you're out of the area where you're going to affect upwelling?
Well, you'll always, I mean, no matter where you are, you'll affect upwelling. But I think the question is, will you affect the productivity, the sort of downstream impacts of upwelling? And that's where if you alter upwelling somewhere out in the middle of the ocean, it probably won't matter too much relative to doing it right next to the coast. I don't think that there is a number, but I would say that that sort of coastal band of the strongest upwelling it's within, say, 20 kilometers or so. So I think being offshore of that is good.
Follow on to that question. I recollect I read one of your papers that indicated that you found little effect in the 0 to 10 kilometer range along the coast. Is that still your finding? And if so, why do you think that is? Because that's the most productive area you think it'd be impacted the most.
Yeah, it's because of where the wind farms are. So the upwelling in that 10 kilometers next to the coast is not really being altered much because the wind farms are far enough offshore. So the winds right next to the coast are pretty similar with and without the wind farms.
Interesting. Thank you. Next question, Brian.
Hey, Mike, thanks, Dave. Thanks so much for this great briefing. Looks like a fascinating study. Look forward to seeing what as this thing further matures. I have sort of a question on looking the other way. I think you said your spatial resolution was about 3 kilometers for the modeling that you're doing. And I'm curious about that, given that it looks like the increase in upwelling and associated plankton down the downstream from that was higher to the west and lighter to the south. And I'm interested because the current shipping channels and the Coast Guard's proposed offshore fairways scoot just west of the wind farms. And I'm wondering if in your study you have enough resolution to kind of tell like how close to the edge of the wind farm do you see this real market increase? In other words, do you get the bright red increase right on the edge of the wind farm, or is it upstream further to the west a couple of miles? Do you have any sense of that?
I'm just looking quickly here. It's interesting. I mean, so I don't know, not to state the obvious, but we can tell that with 3-kilometer resolution, right? So we can say to that precision whether it's right at the edge. For the phytoplankton changes, they look like they're right at the west edge of Morro Bay, with that 3-kilometer precision.
Great. So it kind of extends. You're doing a little bit of real projecting here, but assuming that the food web follows the plankton, right? That increases the likely density of larger organisms, we'll say, right where the shipping lanes would be outside of these wind farms. Yes.
That I will definitely not go out on that one.
Very smart man. Thank you.
No, not a chance.
All right, we have time for one last question. Steve, join me.
Thanks, Mike. You interacting at all with the folks doing the West Coast Strategic Science Plan impacts from offshore wind with what you're doing there, and also kind of following up on Michelle's question, Mike Conroy's. We'd like to have maybe look at what percent of on an average year in these areas of say larval groundfish species, for example, are inshore where there's reduced upwelling and what is offshore, which was increased upwelling. And then also, the tribes in Washington that have treaty rights on these species that originate in California. The concern is not these 2 or 5 existing lease areas, but eventually when it's at 25 gigawatts, what's the cumulative impact and how you could get to that level of research.
All right, I'll try to take these one at a time. So for the strategic planning, I'm just working with colleagues in fisheries who are more plugged into the broader network. So Kelly Andrews is sort of the main point person on the West Coast, and sort of relying on he and others to plug us in or plug our stuff into the broader planning. Percentage of larval groundfish. This is a great question for a physical oceanographer. I mean I don't know. There's like Jamil and Owen aren't in the room today, I'm assuming. I will say that this, like, the increases are all off the shelf. I mean, maybe larval groundfish may be off the shelf as well, but everything we're talking about is where bottom depths are deep. Yeah, all the major impacts we're talking about are where bottom depths are thousands of meters, I would say. I don't know if that's helpful at all, but I would otherwise punt to Jamil and Owen as a follow-up to them. And then, yeah, the cumulative impact, I mean, similar to Mike's question, I think it's a great question. From the modeling perspective, it's not hard to do. If we have, you say, okay, here are additional areas that we envision as being built out, they can be pretty easily added into the model, and you can run it and see what you get. Yeah, I think there just has to be sort of the, I don't know, foundation from which we decide what modeling studies to do and what people want to see.
Thank you.
All right, well, thank you so much for your presentation. Well done.
Thanks very much.
Okay, our next speaker today will be introduced by Brian.
Yes, sir. We had the good fortune to have with us today Commander Brandon Harris, who's a longtime friend and colleague. Has been sailing the waters of the Pacific pretty much since they kicked him out of the academy and put him loose on the rest of us. He's got a really fantastic background to talk about the Coast Guard's Pacific area port access route study, which, for context, I think we touched on this briefly before, but unlike previous port access route studies, Coast Guard undertook to not go port by port, but rather to do a system-wide look at the whole west coast of the United States. That wrapped up a couple of years ago, the final report of the study, which was a set of recommendations. I suspect we'll all have a good set of questions about those recommendations, but also looking forward with, given his current position in running the waterways for Oregon and Washington and the offshore area, all that the Coast Guard is looking forward to do to take action on those recommendations and what that process is like to look like. So as I mentioned, I've worked with Brandon before, but we're really lucky to have him in another regard, which is that in addition to understanding all of these sort of map safety and waterways management issues, this is a guy who's devoted a large chunk of his Coast Guard career to doing the heavy lift work of ACE navigation. And so I suspect there's a lot of folks that will have thoughts or concerns about traffic in and around wind farms and marking and how we think about hazards to navigation versus no entry areas and all that sort of stuff. And boy, do we have the right guy to answer any kind of questions you have with that. And with that, I'll turn it over to you. Thanks so much for being here.
Thanks. I really appreciate the kind words and the introduction, and really was a pleasure to receive the invitation to present in front of this group. As we discussed, the study kicked off in the summer of 2021, and I'll quickly read through the final executive summary of the final report that was completed in the May-June timeframe of 2023 and is now available on the Federal Register for anybody who's interested in reading through the full study, and which also provides responses to specific comments that were made during the numerous public comment periods and provide a lot of information in the Coast Guard's formal response to each of those comments at that point in time. So the executive summary starts with the Pacific Area Port Access Route Study was initiated in 2021 to determine whether new or modified vessel routing measures were needed to ensure safety of navigation along the U.S. Pacific coast due to the quickly evolving demand for use of coastal waters. In recent years, a growing number of stakeholders and organizations have required use of coastal waters for proposed offshore wind developments, new aquacultural projects, space mission launches and recoveries, military exercises, commercial fisheries, and national marine sanctuaries, all in addition to a general increase in vessel traffic. The work group that conducted this study examined vessel traffic data from the past decade and collected input and data from key stakeholders, tribal governments, and the public to develop this study recommendations with the goal to ensure continued safe, efficient, and predictable vessel navigation alongside other reasonable waterways uses. On July 28, 2021, the PAC Area Commander issued a notice of study, publicly announced the PAC bars in the Federal Register. The notice of study incorporated a 180-day comment period to offer an opportunity to industry, federal, state, local, and tribal governments and members of the public to engage in the study process and to meet with the work group to discuss specific concerns if desired. In addition, the PAC Area Command, 11th District, 13th District, sector stations, and ACE navigation teams collaborated to carry out a public affairs campaign to notify as many interested in potential affected organizations and members of the public as possible. A supplemental notice of inquiry was issued by the 11th District, which is California,
and released in the Federal Register under the same docket number on February 24th, 2022, which was open for 90-day comment period. The purpose of the NOI was to solicit additional public input regarding 4 California offshore areas due to status of other federal projects and comments received during the NOS. To provide maximum opportunity for public input, the Coast Guard published a notice of availability of draft study and a request for comment in the Federal Register in August of 2022 under the same docket number. The draft study contained recommended vessel routing measures based on previously received public comments and data analysis. Originally, it allowed for a 60-day comment period, which the Tac Area Command extended to additional 14 days due to multiple requests from the public to have more time to compile input and to provide additional opportunity for all stakeholders to participate in the comment period. The Coast Guard carefully evaluated the comments received on the draft study and combined with continued data analysis proposes the following recommendations. The Commandant will validate these recommendations and initiate the federal rulemaking process as required. As a result of this study, the Coast Guard recommends a 15 nautical mile wide coastwide fairway that follows existing vessel traffic patterns and connects with existing traffic separation schemes at the Strait of Juan de Fuca on the northern edge, San Francisco, Santa Barbara, and Los Angeles, Long Beach. A 5 nautical mile wide San Diego fairway, a 5 nautical mile wide Point Mugu fairway to direct traffic from LALB through the Channel Islands National Marine Sanctuary to make accommodations for DoD training and testing ranges. A 5 nautical mile wide nearshore fairway north of San Francisco, a coastal fairway zone that overlaps the existing Crabber Towboat Lane Agreement in Washington, Oregon. The removal of the IMO recommended routes located offshore of Monterey Bay National Marine Sanctuary, and the continued support for the voluntary practice of bulk chemical and petroleum carriers to keep 50 nautical miles offshore without charted lanes in accordance with the 2002 Pacific States British Columbia Oil Spill Task Force recommendation. Okay, so that was just a quick synopsis of what we ended up with, and now I'll go further into the presentation. Next slide, please. Okay, so what is a port access route study? It's a required study that the Coast Guard must conduct in order to determine if any formally federally authorized routing measures are to be implemented through the waterways. So in this case, we were doing a comprehensive study throughout the entirety of the West Coast from the Mexico-U.S. border to the Canadian-U.S. border. And the first time that we've conducted such an extensive one on the West Coast. And this was after getting numerous inquiries on different uses of the waterway as we saw increased activity and other potential federal and public projects in the area. And our main goal is to ensure safety of navigation in that area. So ensuring that we're maintaining those waterways for the use of vessels safely moving from one port to another, whether that's recreationally or carrying commercial activities or fishing vessels transiting through an area. So it's required to establish new or adjust the existing fairway or traffic separation scheme. A fairway is a voluntary measure, so it allows vessels to choose to either transit inside or outside of the fairway. The primary utilization of a fairway is to ensure that no temporary or permanent structures are constructed within that span of water. So it's keeping it off for vessel traffic alone. It doesn't keep us from placing agents and navigations in that area, and it also doesn't keep fishing vessels from actively fishing in that area, which might include laying pots and such. It may be prompted by safe navigation inquiries or major development plans on or near the waterway. Next slide, please. Keep clicking through, there's a couple more comments come up. Yeah, that's good. Okay, so the U.S. Coast Guard's role and authorities for these measures stems from the Ports and Waterways Safety Act, which is in 46 U.S. Code 70,003. And in this case, it allows us to manage vessel traffic through fairways, traffic separation schemes, channels, and establishing aids navigation. And the aids navigation can be hardware that is physically in the water, or it can also be, now we have electronic aids navigation that we are able to put out and transmit the vessel traffic as well. Traffic separation schemes are normally on approaches to ports. So the major ones we have on the West Coast are into the Straits of Juan de Fuca and down through Puget Sound, and up to Canada, as well as into San Francisco and down to LALB. And there's a couple other ones, throughout there as well. Next slide, please. So for the packed cars, specifically, what we were looking at in 2020 and 2021 were some proposals from NOAA with regard to avoiding expansion of so the Channel Islands, specifically the National Marine Sanctuary down there, and vessel traffic. So it's a very it's with the Channel Islands, it's a very condensed area with a lot going on between the environmental side of it, vessel traffic side of it, and then there's also some DoD type impacts as well down there. We also were engaging with BOEM for potential wind energy areas and lease areas for offshore renewable energy. There has been a significant increase in space activity throughout the region, mostly on the California coast, whether it's a launch or recovery of a space vessel. And then also other new infrastructure, including aquafarms and commercial and government activities that were being proposed. And then throughout the West Coast, there are vast expanses of the ocean that are designated as DoD weapons ranges or for other DoD usage. So we also had to take that into account for our own impacts on vessel traffic and impacts on potential proposed projects. We were also looking to see what sort of increased vessel traffic there was out there. And the data sets we used were AIS. So AIS was initially established in the late 2000s, required as of 2002 to be included on each new build of large vessels. And by 2008, all existing vessels over, I believe, 65 feet in length were required to install AIS. And then we also used VMS vessel monitoring system, which was a more NOAA-led effort to track fisheries throughout the Pacific Northwest, so we could get a little bit more fidelity on some of those vessels. So being that it's fairly new technology, we chose to use the data sets from about a decade before the study took place. So from 2012 to 2021, we chose 7 years of data to incorporate into the study. And we did notice that there was some increase in AIS tracks over that time period. What we are struggling to fully understand is that because there's actual increased vessel traffic, or is it a lot due to increased AIS usage on ships? And what we found is that most of the increased AIS pings were from recreational vessels. So most recreational vessels aren't required to carry AIS, but over the years, increased number of vessels have. So we believe that is the primary driver of the increased vessel activity. Next slide, please. So the coastal analysis covered a total of 6 different types of vessels. So we were looking at fishing, cargo, tanker, tug and tows, passenger, recreational vessels. And the picture on the right is just a depiction of total vessel traffic of all the data that was incorporated, and it shows kind of where the hotspots are based on the coloring on the chart. So you can see really coming out of Puget Sound through the Strait of Juan de Fuca, coming out of San Francisco, coming out of LALB. Those are like red areas to show that there's a lot of obviously a lot of vessel traffic in and out of those ports, but also you can see there's significant vessel traffic right along the west coast of the United States, all the way from the Canadian border down to the Mexican border, showing that historically those vessels have been navigating those specific traffic patterns for a considerable period of time. And this is kind of the analytics that we put into the process, but we also then incorporated a lot of the public comments and public outreach to different entities, such as harbor safety committees. We closely coordinated with BOEM on where they were proposing their wind energy areas. And also a lot of tribal outreach as well. We sent all the coastal tribes a formal letter to let them know that we were conducting the study, and also giving them the opportunity to request formal government consultation on the project as well, which was taken into account throughout the exercise. Next slide, please. This is just another quick depiction of some of the data that was looked at. So the picture on the left is all vessel activity captured during that time period. The one in the middle is tug and tows. So specifically why we were looking so closely at tug and tows is we had outreach from the crabber towboat community in Washington, and there was a 1971 agreement between the crabbing community and the tug and tow vessels and companies to set up handshake agreements on where they would have the tug and tows transit during certain times of the year. So in 1971, the Washington Seaport Alliance had negotiated this, and then each year they meet several times and they revalidate where they are based on what the crabbing community needs and what works best for the tug and tows. So they provided us with those 50-year-old fairways that they had put into place, and we did a thorough analysis, and we validated that they are really being used quite consistently by those communities to support safe navigation, make sure that they're limiting impact of the crab pots on the other vessel traffic, and also limiting damage to the crab pots in the commercial fishing fleet that they were having to deal with at that time. And then the right side is a depiction of all fishing activity that had taken place during that time as well. So you see in the Pacific Northwest, obviously there is a heavy density of fishing activity. And while fairways and traffic separation schemes aren't designated to protect fishing areas, we do evaluate the transits of where those vessels are taking place to ensure that they can safely go to and from port. And then overall, we just had close communication with them, informing them that as these wind energy areas are established, that there would be an additional navigation safety risk assessment conducted by the leasee that had been awarded those wind energy areas in conjunction and evaluated by the U.S. Coast Guard to determine what the proper risk mitigation needed to take place to ensure safety of navigation in and around those areas. Next slide, please. It's just a quick look at kind of, you can't really see it too well, but the picture on the left shows passage lines. So we determined approximately 16 passage lines up and down the west coast and in and out of ports to measure what sort of vessel activity was occurring in those specific areas. So then we could evaluate it year on year to determine if it was increasing or not, and we could also see specifically where the heaviest usage of the waterways were and get an evaluation and understanding of where vessels are choosing to safely navigate on their own. But right now, there's no north-south formal routing measures established on the West Coast. So this is all based on mariners conducting safe navigation, doing their trip plans and determining what and it's pretty incredible to see how they all choose to really navigate within some pretty narrow lanes and leave a lot of the ocean open for further use if it's so determined. Next slide, please. Just a quick look at the timeline as discussed. The notice of study was published in July of 2021, and then we ended up doing a total of 270 days of public comment with the California NOI included at the end. And then we utilized the next year or so to conduct the PAC-PAR study to analyze that data and to also review the comments and to conduct a lot of public outreach where we were going out and having formal public meetings and receiving comments in addition to what we were accepting on the Federal Register. After the draft study was published, we then had another 60-day comment period because that included our recommended initial fairways that were proposed off the coast and then into and out of ports. We received approximately 192 actual comments. I think if you count all the signatures included on those comments, it turned into 22,000 plus formal comments to the docket. So we carefully reviewed those. We conducted additional outreach to some organizations. We closely coordinated with NOAA and FOAM, and we made some adjustments to those recommended fairways. In the coming slides, I'll show you both what the original recommended fairways were, as well as our final recommendations that are currently at Coast Guard headquarters for review. So on the 25th of October, 2022, we completed that comment period. And then the final product was signed by the PAC Area Commander in June of 2023, and it has been submitted to Coast Guard headquarters for further action at this time. Next slide, please. So this is a depiction of the initial recommendations for the fairways. So it might be a little hard to see. I'd be happy to show you guys closer hard copies versions of this if you'd like to, but it also shows some overlays of the fairways are the black lines. So there is a 15-mile wide north-south fairway that runs anywhere from 25 to 40 nautical miles off of the coast. Then we also chose to have a coastal fairway, which starts from 3 miles out from the baseline and then overlays the Crabber Cove agreed fairways that had been established in 1971. And then of the ports that we chose, so there were 9 total ports that we analyzed for vessel traffic in and out of those areas. We chose to establish, or we recommended establishing ingress and egress fairways for the Columbia River, Coos Bay, San Francisco, LALD, and down to San Diego, I believe. And we did not touch, for the most part, any existing traffic separation scheme. So we chose to have the north end cut off at the start of the San Juan traffic separation scheme. And we also worked to avoid as best as possible any national marine sanctuaries, areas to be avoided and such. So if you look closer, you can't really see it from here, but for the north end up through the state of Washington, there's a rather expansive area to be avoided. We did not run the Crabber towboat lanes, the coastal fairways up to that area. We're not looking to encourage further vessel traffic through an area to be avoided. Next slide, please. So our recommendations, and this is specifically for District 13. So Coast Guard District 13 is the states of Oregon and Washington off the coast. So you can see that out of the Columbia River, we recommended that there was a 5 nautical mile wide east-west fairway. And then also based on historical vessel traffic patterns, we saw that there was significant vessel traffic that was kind of taken an angle to meet the wider north and south measures. So we initially included those fairways in Fort Coos Bay specifically, it looked, most vessel traffic had chosen to, take it a northeast or a southwest approach to and from the port. So we initially didn't include the direct east-west fairway. And you'll see further on in the next slide that we also did significant overlays with all the other activity that's going on out there, whether that's the DoD or the recommended BOEM lease areas. And yeah, can you just click through the next slide, please? So this has a lot more of those overlays, and this is the final District 13 recommended fairways. So you can see that we made the entrances to both the Columbia River and the Coos Bay more of a cone shape. So this still accommodates the angles that they were asking. It also accommodates best approaches during specific environmental. So the Pacific Northwest is known for having extremely hazardous weather. So it gives the mariners the latitude to choose their approach angle that best accommodates based on the sea states that they're observing. And it also better supported some of the BOEM lease areas. So specifically off of Coos Bay, about 2/3 of the bottom of that lease area had already been excluded from being available due to a DoD weapons range. So we were able to fit that whole approach fairway within that area. Some of the northern section of that call area is impacted by the existing crabber towboat lane, so it is covered by that coastal fairway. But we had significant discussions with BOEM throughout that process. In BOEM's, as you guys are all very much aware, they're very interested in 1,300 meters and less in depth. So that reddish area off the coast designates that 1,300 meter curve. So you can see that a lot of that falls inside of that offshore fairway. So that lined up pretty nicely in terms of both our study and for BOEM's request of areas that they were interested in developing offshore renewable energy. Next slide, please. So this is the District 11 recommended fairways, and as you can see again, the 1,300 meter curve, and then their proposed fairways are the white lines up and down the coast. You can see the proposed wind energy areas off of Morro Bay and off of Humboldt Bay. There were lots of discussions between BOEM and District 11 on trying to create the least amount of impact as possible to the area that BOEM was trying to utilize, and also to leave all national marine sanctuaries as protected as possible. Make sure if we were required to route vessel traffic, or there is a lot of existing vessel traffic through national marine sanctuaries, trying to make that as fast and effective and minimize the impact to the water as possible, as well as trying to avoid seamounts and other features of the seafloor that would be impacted, the environmental side of it as well. And then lots and lots of discussions with DoD as well in terms of trying to mitigate the impact of their weapons ranges of vessel traffic. So the Coast Guard does notices through our broadcast notice to mariners anytime a weapons range goes active, to encourage vessel traffic to stay out of there, and whatever unit is conducting the activity needs to monitor vessel traffic that's going through, and then they're not allowed to actually utilize the range if it's impacted by vessel traffic. So trying to mitigate and decrease the interactions there and support DoD as best we could. Next slide, please. So where we're standing right now, as I said, is it was released at headquarters in June of 2023. Headquarters reviewed and supported the final study, and they have since contracted a environmental impact study to ensure that we're meeting all requirements of the NEPA process. So that EIS is currently ongoing, and we're awaiting the formal results of that. Once that is complete, the proposal for final rulemaking will be submitted to the Federal Register. And it'll go through another public comment period, and then we'll be standing by to review and determine if the Coast Guard is able to formally incorporate those into the Federal Register and place them on NOAA charts and such. All other applicable federal agencies are very much aware of the study and the Coast Guard recommendations, and BOEM is utilizing the current recommendations to determine their future actions in the area as well. So we're trying to be as transparent, open, and good partners in this effort as we can, but also ensuring that we are supporting our primary authorities, which is the safety of navigation in these waterways and ensure efficient usage for vessel traffic. And that being said, definitely open to any questions that you might have. I'll try to answer them as best I can, and really appreciate you guys inviting me here and the discussion that I've been able to hear so far.
Very good. So we'll open the floor for questions. I'll go ahead and lead off as people get their cards ready. Question I have, you know, in the study itself, I noted you found roughly 8,000 vessels transiting the area per year, and maybe 40% were commercial shipping and 40% were recreational. Sure. And the study noted there was quite a bit of growth over that 3-year period, the 18 to 21. Did you accommodate growth in your decision on the width of waterways, or is it kind of lost in the noise?
So we did, what we determined was that most of the growth was in the recreational vessel traffic. Recreational vessel traffic is historically, it doesn't really follow designated routing measures. So we found that all of the commercial entities were, for the most part, steady, or maybe slight growth or slight decrease, often taking into account the COVID-19 year took place and passenger vessel traffic significantly decreased in 2020 and 2021. But yeah, so we did not really take it into account in terms of the width of the fairway, because the vessel traffic that we are trying to accommodate with these fairways seems to be steady during this period.
Okay, good. Let's see, Michelle.
Yeah, thank you, Commander, for the presentation. And first of all, I want to commend you on the PACPAR study. I work in Washington State and very closely with commercial fishers, including the Coastal and Columbia River Judgment Crab Fishing Association, and have heard nothing but good things of the PACPAR study, how it was conducted, the stakeholder outreach. They really felt that their concerns were listened to, and yeah, they're not the easiest to please. So, you touched on this on your last slide, but I'll say, in just tracking the completion of the PACPARs in 2023, I guess we had anticipated that there would be regulations coming out in 2024 or shortly thereafter. So could you talk more about the EIS that's ongoing, where you are, when you expect that to be completed, and kind of the next steps from there in terms of regulations?
Yes, I'm happy to. Yeah, definitely. We were hoping for a more expedited timeline. That's everybody is aware that government moves at the pace the government moves at. Coast Guard headquarters prioritized initially getting the East Coast routing measures finalized in advance. So they chose to start the EIS on those East Coast measures before moving on to the West Coast measures. So the West Coast EIS, I think, began in or around January of this year. And they're telling us it's going to be a most likely 12 to 18-month process. So we're hopeful that maybe by sometime next summer, we'll get results on that. And then obviously the formal regulatory process will start at that point. As noted, we're hopeful it's fairly expedited. We've tried to conduct all the public outreach and discussions in advance, so hopefully we've mitigated a lot of the discussions that will potentially take place. But there's no guarantee it's gonna be quick. So, we're standing by to answer any questions, and we're constantly checking in with headquarters to see what the status is. But hopefully sometime in the next few years, but definitely no guarantees.
Dave Chairman?
Oh, yeah, thank you. Curious of fairways or port access routes been altered and as increasing knowledge about whale populations and their occurrence.
So there was a lot of coordination with NOAA throughout the study. So we looked at what they were able to provide us for data in terms of where they had seen large populations of whales and where whales were choosing to transit through the water. So that was taken into account as best we can. As discussed, our primary concern throughout this process is safety of navigation. So we're looking to mitigate negative impacts on the environment by vessel incidents out there. So while we did look at it and we confirmed that specifically the offshore, the 15-mile wide offshore fairway is really outside of most of what NOAA had proposed to us as being areas of a lot of whale activity. So we took into account as best we can, but the primary decision maker was looking at historical vessel traffic patterns.
Yes, there's two issues that come to mind. One is off of Southern California, where the Channel Islands routing, I think was affected by an increase in knowledge of where the whales were inside of the Channel Islands. If I recall correctly, it was moved offshore, but I'm not, that's sort of out of our range here. But what comes to mind is that the possibility that if offshore wind farms are located, they may alter the behavior and occurrence of small pelagic fish or other prey of whales that may in turn lead to a sort of knock-on effect in the distribution of whales. I guess what I've heard today from you, thankfully, is that there sort of is a remedy for that in a way by altering the navigational pathways, but it's a long process.
Yes, sir.
But, you know, let's say a wind farm went in and it caused whales to move 20 miles or 10 miles shoreward, or just hypothetically, and it started to bump up against a fairway or, you know, a routing passage, whatever it's called. Very curious, what would the response be? What would happen in a case like that?
Yeah, so obviously we're closely monitoring that and we're staying in close communications with NOAA on a lot of those impacts. And for each one of these actions that's going to be taken, like right now, we're doing the environmental study on the fairway. So that hopefully will tell us a little bit more about that environmental impact. But then also, as the wind energy areas are leased out and they develop those projects, they're required to do their own NEPA action on those to try to assess what those impacts are going to be, as well as our own navigational risk assessments in terms of what this leasing is proposing, what do we think the impacts on vessel traffic in that area are going to be, and in turn, the environmental impacts as well. So it's I think a thorough process, but obviously we can't tell at this point what is going to happen with the marine life. So we'll look to adapt and adjust as best we can, ensuring that vessels can transit safely through these areas and not exacerbate any environmental issues that are being caused by existing human activity on the waterways.
Thank you.
Okay, Robert, you have a question?
Yeah. Regarding the wind energy areas, my understanding is you took into account, you know, where Bessie has said, you know, these are going to be our areas, and you did your best, I'm assuming, to work around those areas.
Yeah, we did. And for the most part, it actually worked out fairly well in a lot of those. They had some asks. So when we put out the initial draft recommendations, they had some asks and requests for us to move things around to accommodate them a little bit better. So yeah, I would say that those discussions were pretty open and transparent from both agencies, and they went pretty seamlessly from my end. Nobody was 100% satisfied with the end results, but also understanding that in order to effectively execute our authorities and our requirements, that we were doing what was in the best interest of both vessel safety and trying to increase opportunities for offshore energy throughout the West Coast.
Right. And specifically traffic that would be going to and from these wind energy areas during, installation, operations, they would be expected to follow these fairways as well, correct?
So these fairways are 100% voluntary.
Sure.
So yeah, but so we are, part of that is, yes, there will be increased vessel traffic in those areas as they're building and maintaining those wind energy areas. So hopefully this also provides a safe and effective routing system for them to get to and from whatever ports end up developing the local infrastructure to support.
Okay, next question, Mike Conlon.
Yeah, hi, two-part question. I think the first part will be relatively easy, the second one probably not so much. I'm assuming that when the final EIS comes out, all the spatial data that was used to inform the fairways will be included within that document?
So the data is already included in the final EIS as includers. So if you go to the Federal Register, you should be able to access that. And if anybody is having trouble locating that, I'd be happy to provide it.
Okay, and then the second one, which probably isn't as easy. When the PACPARs started, there was no sea space that had been identified by the California Energy Commission as being suitable for offshore wind. That was done subsequent to the publication of the draft PACPARs. Was there consideration of those? Because I know that some of the areas that were identified by the Energy Commission were the fairways went right through the middle of them. So were there any subsequent conversations that were held that considered moving the fairways outside of those areas that had been identified by the Energy Commission, but not yet deemed call areas by BOEM?
No, there were several comments from several California entities to the draft recommendations. And that District 11 had a lot of discussions with those entities on potential solutions. I think there were some slight adjustments, but in some cases, we were just unable to adjust the recommended fairways to fully accommodate what they were asking for.
Okay, thank you very much. Appreciate that. And thanks for all you do.
Thank you.
Brandon, could you talk a little bit more about how you approached the tribe, how that communication went, and any lessons learned from that area?
Sure. So yeah, as I noted, we sent a formal letter to each, so signed by the district commanders, inviting the tribes to take part in this full study process. We received several responses, and a lot of it was just trying to understand exactly what the study consisted of and how it might potentially impact their usual and custom fishing grounds and their treaty rights. For a lot of those initial responses, we were able to set up follow-on meetings and walk them through what the study consisted of, what the end goal was, and just help keep them informed and understand that if they should expect any changes in navigation. We had one specific request for formal consultation with the Makah tribe. And what the Makah tribe wanted to understand was, should they expect any really shifts in vessel traffic over the long term that are going to impact their fisheries rights in the area. So we went out to Nia Bay and we had a good discussion with them on that. In the end result, they were pretty satisfied with the data that we were able to present from them and help understanding that the proposed fairways accommodated the majority of that vessel traffic already. So we really didn't expect any changes in that vessel traffic. And most of the stuff that fell outside of the fairways was a lot of recreational vessels, which weren't most likely gonna navigate by the fairways anyways. So I think overall lessons learned are just to start that process early and provide the awareness to them and allow the opportunity to take part and be ready and able to hopefully answer any questions that they might have. And obviously, if they had recognized any impacts to their treaty rights, then we would have ensured that we had accommodated those throughout. But at the end of the day, we were able to satisfy all the questions they had.
Very good. Okay, seeing no other questions, Brian, do you have anything to add?
Just one thing. It's a great job explaining a really multi-year, very complicated regional study. I think for a point of clarification, in terms of once the EIS is completed, I just want to make sure I'm understanding correctly the possible ways this could go. So when the EIS comes in, the Coast Guard will decide whether it wants to adjust any of the recommended measures based on that information. And whatever it decides, it would then publish in a notice of proposed rulemaking or something similar to that in the Federal Register.
Yes, sir.
And that's primarily for things that are in the territorial seas, as opposed to the offshore fairways. How does that work? Because the offshore fairways, I think, are International Maritime Organization engagement. So
Yeah, I'll have to go back and check, sir. From my understanding, since it's in the exclusive economic zone, that we can establish the fairways without IMO taking part. That's what headquarters had told me to date. But I can definitely go back and ask that question.
that's very helpful. Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you very much for the presentation. Well done, and we all appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you.
Great.
Oh, sorry,
So Mike's not allowed to ask questions.
Wait, Mike's got another question. Oh, well, go right ahead and use it on.
He's Coast Guard headquarters, so he might be able to answer the question better.
Very good.
So, good morning, everybody, or good afternoon. Just to relay on Brian's question, yes, it'll go through our regulation process within the U.S., but then simultaneously, when the next IMO board comes up, headquarters will look at proposing those fairways to be in the IMO as well. And that's the same process that we're doing with the Atlantic coast, should we proceed with fairways based off of the information we get from the environmental study.
Awesome, great. So it's the recommended routing measures, and it's the transit routes in addition to the fairways that we established. It's kind of both things simultaneously.
Yes, it'll be both.
Great, awesome.
Thanks, Mike.
Yep.
Great, thank you. Ready for lunch?
Thanks, everybody. We'll be back online in about an hour.
Okay, we have one last public session and speaker. Brian, you're going to do the intro.
So is Kelly online? There she is. Hey, so we're fortunate to be joined by a couple of retired Coast Guard captains who can really help illuminate some of the core subjects that we're talking about. Captain Kelly Denning is online. And we're fortunate that she could make time for us from down there in the Gulf to talk about her experience, particularly in New England. And Kelly's got a broad experience in the Coast Guard which I'll let Kelly, if you wanna walk us through your history, that's great. But I think, for our purposes, really we're fortunate to have pretty much the author of the Coast Guard's general approach to how it provides input to BOEM on wind energy areas, and more importantly, how it is adjusting its operations to take account of wind energy areas, wind arrays. Kelly brings a wealth of experience because she understands the Gulf and all of the oil and gas industry, and which is a predicate to a lot of how we got where we are. But I think, Kelly, you guys were first and learned everything the hard way and did all the heavy lifting to the rest of us. And so we're really grateful to have you, and thanks for making time.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for having me. Good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. I will go through just a quick bio because I think you guys have already seen that. But essentially, I graduated from the Coast Guard Academy in '98. I started off underway on ships, so I spent about 6 years underway, and then I transitioned into the response ashore community. So my specialty was in search and rescue, law enforcement, marine environmental protection, and emergency management and fisheries management as well. So I'll start off with a story, the early days of wind energy in D1. It was 2018, and I was asked to be put on a team at the first district in Boston, Massachusetts. And I was brought in again because I brought in a different skill set than the folks that are normally looking at this from the marine safety side, as far as bringing in the response community side. So they brought together this team because there were a lot of projects that were coming up across the district. So they were looking for us to provide recommendations and then offer consistencies as well, just across the board, which are of course always important when you're looking at these type of developments offshore. So at the time we had developments that were going in off of Massachusetts, New York, and Maine, and we already had the Block Island wind farms. It was just 5 fixed structures there. They were pretty small though, but we did have some already in the area off Rhode Island. Um, but so I was brought in, and my first introduction, we went to a offshore renewables energy conference in New York City, and it was huge. I had no idea that this industry was so big and was already moving so much, but it had moved a lot in Europe, so a lot of those people had come over for the conference. So we had regulators, we had energy companies, we had waterway users, and more. And in my initial conversations with the companies, I was asking them, oh, okay, well, what are the patterns going to be? How are the turbines going to be, associated with one another? Is there going to be spacing issues? And they just kind of looked at me and said, no, we're just going to put them where it makes sense based on the ocean floor and based on, the wind coming in. And that's what we plan to do. I said, oh, okay. I said, well, are you going to close it off so you're not going to have any other marine traffic go through there? And they said, no, we'll let people go in and out. And I'm like, oh my gosh, that's like a search and rescue nightmare to somebody like me. But again, that's why we really greatly appreciated being brought into the process at that point. And over the next couple of years, I worked with the team and we developed some sound recommendations, and many of them have been captured now in NAVIC 0223, that Coast Guard roles and responsibilities of the offshore renewable energy installations on the Outer Continental Shelf. But I'll go ahead and give you some of my lessons learned during the process. And then again, look forward to any questions you might have afterward. Yes.
Ricky, before you go into your lessons learned, I just for everybody so that you're tracking what that document that Kelly just referenced is pretty important in the Coast Guard, but unless you run in those circles, you likely don't know what that is. It's a navigation and vessel inspection circular. It's the agency's way of communicating with itself and with the public. It is not regulative. It has no binding authority. It is more or less a statement of general policy and process, so that everybody's on the same page. And bottom line is, although she's not taking credit for it, basically Kelly wrote this the hard way. So thanks, Kelly. Thanks for letting me put that out there.
Sure, no problem. Thank you for that. I'm not sure how, what y'all have looked at and what you haven't looked at. So please jump in if I say something that you're not familiar with. So as a cooperating agency, the Coast Guard used various forms to gather input from the federal, state, local, and tribal governments, as well as other interested parties. So we used our Fisheries Management Council, harbor safety committees, our area committees for the pollution response side, area maritime security committees, law enforcement committees, and just more, trying to gather information. What are the concerns from our communities that we can take and consider as we inform these PAR studies and the environmental impact statements and all the things that were being developed at the time. So my number one best practice for response agencies at all levels is to communicate with the companies early and often and involve all the parties in an exercise program. That was really key to our success in getting good, solid recommendations. We started with discussion-based and tabletop exercises, and then we moved to full-scale exercises with Block Island Wind on search and rescue. So by doing that, we found many things. One of them was safety zones. So at some points, those might be necessary. We found that it wouldn't be necessary all the time, but there are certain higher risk evolutions where you might want to consider it, such as the construction phase. So just, know that that's in your pocket if that's something that you need to use. As well, we recommended that the companies should have their own contracted services for security and search and rescue. And then for the response agencies, we need to know what those are and what their capabilities are, what their weather limitations are, any medical services that they have on board, and just have that awareness of what their capabilities are. For example, down here in the Gulf of Mexico, we have the Loop, the Louisiana offshore oil port. They have their own security boat, but if they get in a bad situation, they call the Coast Guard, and we of course go and help them out if they need some extra muscle. Okay. For the specific turbines, response agencies that sometimes may ask for the turbine shutdown in advance of arrival of the search and rescue asset. It might be an individual turbine, it might be a whole row that's next to the search and rescue response. But you just need to work with those individual companies to find out how long that shutdown process is going to take. And when you're dealing with a person in the water, especially up in New England, minutes really do count as far as when you can get that person out, whether or not they're going to be alive or deceased. And then it seems like a simple thing, but make sure you have the right phone numbers. That's something we find in a lot of our exercises. It seems like a basic thing, but it can really cost you minutes and sometimes more if you don't have the right number of the person that's in charge of shutting down that turbine. So just make sure that all the phone numbers that you have are accurate, and then you need to, take a look at that once or twice a year. And then if you're having to shut down an individual like wind turbine to where you're sending a helicopter in to winch an individual off of that, there are specific positions that the aviators like to have that. So we did have an aviation expert on our team as well. For the ones in New England, what they had asked for, they needed the blades feathered and braked, and the nacelle was turned at 90 degrees off the wind. So they got into real specifics of what they needed, but that's good. And you talk about that stuff before you actually have to go into the response. For the New England areas, there were offshore substations as well as the turbines. So we also took a look at, what search and rescue would look at with regard to that, because that would be a little bit different, turbine versus the substation. So just to have that consideration. And then we also worked with the control centers that were back on shore. So all of these companies had basically their own command centers that were back on shore. And they had somebody on their watch floor 24/7 that could step in and act as the incident commander in the event that something happened. And that something didn't have to be limited to search and rescue. They were trained on pollution response, security incidents, law enforcement, anything like that. And we had worked with them in advance to make sure that we understood what actions they would be taking and what actions we would be taking. So that's an important person to meet again before anything happens. Some of the things that you also want to talk about before you get into an incident, which hopefully we never would, is if you do have a tragedy in one of these areas, who is going to be the lead on next of kin notifications, media interactions? Again, taking a look at the pollution, if there's salvage operation, if there's an investigation. Most of that stuff is already laid out, but it's always good to just kind of review it and make sure that everybody, including the companies, understand what would happen in the event that you have a disaster in one of those areas. The Coast Guard has SLDMBs, those are self-locating data marker buoys. They can determine drift around these structures. So I haven't dealt with floating at all. I know that that's what they'd be looking at off California. So I'm sure that's its own animal. But up in New England, with the fixed facilities, they do tend to create a different current than what you would expect were the structures not there. So you want to know maybe how they change the current. We can always drop the SLDMBs to see what happens with that. But that's a good idea to know when you're putting structures in the water, how it's going to impact that surface current. And then in the Coast Guard, our program for search and rescue operations is SAROPS. So that's the one that helps us develop patterns. So if you need to develop a pattern over time, then you have to factor in, the weather, drift, current, your search asset, all of these things. So by putting as much as you can into that system, SAROPS, it's going to spit out the best search pattern possible. So the more information you have to put in on the front end, the better that you have the search operations. So up in the first district, for their SAROPS program, they have specifically put in the all the individual turbines and the height, the blades, as much information as they can in there. So they're not hunting for it if they have a search and rescue case in one of the wind farm areas. It's also good to look at who's going to be your on-scene coordinator during a search and rescue if it's in one of those areas. If you've got multiple assets being used, maybe there's a company boat out there. It might be a good idea because they're the experts on that to maybe assign one of them with a Coast Guard person as an on-scene coordinator to help coordinate your response and rescue assets. We worked closely with BOEM right there at the beginning stages, again, on the placement of the structures. So one of our main recommendations was minimum 0.5 nautical miles between the structures. We would prefer 1 nautical mile, but somewhere in between there is finding the sweet spot by working with the companies to see what they would need. But that works because you've got then your SAR lanes. And if you have a lot of structures, you might even on top of the spacing have to put in larger search and rescue lanes to get the cutters in or to get the helicopters to go through, depending upon the height of your structures and what you're looking at. But again, these are all, you bring in the team, you talk to the aviators, you talk to the cuttermen. I know you got Holly coming on after me. So you guys are already doing that. So just continue to do that and understand what the limitations could be for search and rescue and how you can mitigate those with those SAR lanes. With the nav safety side, that also goes to the traffic separation schemes, right? So you might have to take a look at routing measures such as those. Between the SAR lanes, traffic separation schemes, limited access areas, there's a multitude of things that you can do to make navigation safe for the mariners out there. I was captain on a patrol boat out of Mobile, Alabama. Oh goodness, about 25 years ago now. And we used to do border operations out of Corpus Christi. We still do, but we were still doing them back then. And I remembered it was over Thanksgiving, and my crew, they wanted to be home for Thanksgiving. And so they somehow talked me into just going straight across the Gulf of Mexico from Mobile straight down to Corpus Christi and not taking the fairways, right? That was horrible recommendation. Very scary because you have these structures in the middle of the ocean and they're not all on the charts. You've got some unlit standpipes out there. You've got a lot of things that it was a bad idea. So I'm a big fan of traffic separation schemes, especially at night. Speaking of night, the other thing that we recommended was marking of the structures. So making sure that they're marked and they're labeled and they've got the right lighting configuration and they could signal if need be. And then we also recommended AIS, either put on the structure or on like a payton, so a private aids to navigation. Those can do broadcasts, and then they can also just kind of show where they are in the ocean space. So that was a big recommendation that was taken up. The other thing too, when you're doing search and rescue in the Gulf of Mexico, not only are you looking in the area where you think the person may have drifted to, but you are also looking at all the fixed structures that are out there because they might have crawled up on one, and it's helpful if they can see it and say, I'm at, Alpha 1 or whatever. So then you know exactly where to send your search and rescue asset to go perform the rescue. Let's see. I think that was about it for the lessons learned. And again, we packaged all that up, and I was happy to see that it did make it into the recommendations there. And as a cooperating agency with the Coast Guard, it was, especially in the early days of it, I was like, man, I hope this works, because we were really just offering recommendations. But it was nice. Of course, BOEM listened, and then we worked with Bessie later on the emergency response procedures and the oil spill response plans that these companies also have to have when they're going out there. Again, BOEM and Bessie were great partners and listened to us and took our concerns and made sure that we were able to provide navigational safety and a good shared waterway space. And I think we're in a good space right now for that in New England, and look forward to hearing any questions that you may have.
Hey, any questions? We'll start with Jeremy and then Robert.
Yeah, thank you for that nice overview. So I know on the East Coast, two issues came up that you have to discuss. One was turbine orientation, and that related to initially there were adjacent wind projects that were where the turbines were oriented differently, so it was going to make navigation more difficult. And then also there was requests for transit lanes, so a wider area of say 4 nautical miles in between certain parts of those wind energy areas. And do you have any thoughts on those two topics?
Yeah, orientation is important if they're if they're adjacent. It's helpful if they have the same orientation. And again, yes, the navigation lanes, depending upon what your traffic study is telling you. In those areas, especially in New York, you have a lot of vessel traffic that's coming in. So you need a way to safely manage it and funnel it into a safe lane. So yes, that would be a good recommendation based on whatever your traffic patterns are there in California.
Yeah, it was specifically by commercial fishers who were interested in being able to more directly access portions of the ocean beyond the wind energy areas versus your sort of typical commercial vessel traffic, which is sort of a separate issue. So I was really more referring to, should we, if California builds out in a big way at 25 gigawatts, should we be thinking, and should BOEM be thinking about navigation lanes for commercial fishers to get beyond them?
Yeah, I think that's where you would communicate with your own fishermen out there and find out what they need. I haven't spent too much time doing that on the West Coast, but I mean, I would assume that that's probably something that they would want. But it probably depends on how many structures you're talking about, how tall they are, what the spacing is going to be. I know off Virginia, I think they ended up being about 0.6. Up in New England, they kept it to a mile. That might be enough for the fishermen. But these are all, again, those open and honest communication with your maritime partners, and just people that use the waterway. It's a shared space, so you have to accommodate that.
All right, Robert.
Thanks for the presentation. I had questions about when you were brought into the process and who brought you in, right? Because you talked about, talking to the developers and really explaining to them what they didn't even know about search and rescue. How did that come about? And is that something that's a planned part of the process, or how did that work?
So at the time, I was in the incident management division up there. And so that oversees the command center. So it's kind of a natural fit working with the prevention department. So the command centers and the Coast Guard oversee, all 11 mission sets that the Coast Guard does. So, and we're the ones that are the 24/7 operations. So we have, basically the 911 centers for the Coast Guard. So if something goes wrong, we're going to be the ones that get the first call. So that's why I was brought in for my command center expertise. And then, understanding what we also needed. We have things, so we get the call, and you're not necessarily expected to be an expert on everything. You try, but you're not going to be. So we had over 100, they're called QRCs, they're quick response cards, that outlines like your initial actions and the questions that you need to ask of the person on the phone, just to make sure that the command center is doing everything that they can in those initial moments, to make it a successful response in whatever mission set you're talking about. So it was a natural fit to pull somebody that had command center operations expertise into it to understand what you would need in the event that there was an oil spill, or a search and rescue case, or a law enforcement, anything that you can think of that might happen, or hurricanes. They get hurricanes up there. And they get some pretty nasty nor'easters. What are you going to need to look at? What do you need to consider? So that's why they had brought me in.
Follow on to Robert's question, just to clarify a little bit. I think at the time that you first started getting engaged here to provide feedback, there wasn't a central nationwide Coast Guard set of guidelines. And so each individual Coast Guard command was sort of being approached by BOEM individually and saying, we have this specific project. Do you have any, as a cooperating agency, do you have any input to provide? So am I right about that? Did you have anything from when you got engaged, or was it pretty much just a blank piece of paper?
It was a blank piece of paper. That's why, and they had initially, it was the sector that was running it, and they were overwhelmed. And then we had multiple sectors that were overwhelmed with the same issue. So First District is a helpful one. And so we came in and said, hey, let's take some of this off you, and let's help you out with all these processes that you have to go through, and help out with the recommendations to BOEM. And that's, again, why we were brought in at the district level. And then we did another renewable energy conference just with the Coast Guard folks bringing in D5. So basically a land area one, because Virginia had their project going in. So Virginia learned from the First District as well. And then, ultimately what we had recommended was, hey, this is going to be a lot bigger than just a sector or just one district. Eventually it's going to be Coast Guard wide. So it's nice to see that the Coast Guard has put out some, Coast Guard wide guidance now on the basics of offshore renewable energy. But yes, this is the very early days of it. Hence my first conversation with the company that said they were just going to put them wherever they wanted because they could, because there was no regulation telling them that they couldn't do that.
Steve, and then David. Thank you, Kelly. You mentioned that the current was different. I assume downstream from the towers. Describe that, and do you think it'd be any different with the floating structures that are being planned on the West Coast?
That's a good question. From what I've looked at them, I mean, you've got the anchor points, right? 3 or 4 each. So I'm not sure, but my recommendation would be, if, to do some testing around it, throw in an SLDMB and see what it does, and see if it does change the ocean currents.
Your
It depends
observation,
on how big they are
Yeah.
and how many you've got in one spot.
impact your operations around them.
I'm sorry.
The changes.
So one of our best practices whenever you have a case anyway in those areas is to immediately insert an SLDMB to make sure that you do understand what the currents are doing, because it does change day by day. But I would say anytime you have a case around around one of the structures, it's even more important so that you understand what the currents are doing, because it might be different than what is in our search and rescue program, because SAROPS doesn't account for that yet. There hasn't been any data that's put in there. So you're going to have to go with the real-time data if you have an incident. Does that make sense?
Thank you, Kelly. Do you have any experience or with or knowledge of vessels losing power in the vicinity of rigs, be they oil rigs or offshore energy installations, renewable energy installations, either in the Atlantic or the Gulf, and the advice for this committee on things such as ERTVs or similar capabilities if farms were to be located off the West Coast?
I do. We've had a lot of those down here, and they can get pretty scary, especially if it's a large vessel that loses power and is drifting toward a fixed structure. We've had a lot of those. Thankfully, we also have a lot of offshore service vessels, so OSVs or tugs and tows that are available to potentially help out that can go over from other platforms. I don't know that you'd have that though with the renewable energy, because they don't, I mean, they're going to have the offshore service boats, but you don't have the people that you do. Like we've got a whole city out in the Gulf of Mexico. And so you have boats always going back and forth. So somebody would be, potentially available to help out. But yeah, we have had that. It's cost of, one of those costs of doing business. You hope it doesn't drift into a structure, but the possibility that it could. The Gulf of Mexico obviously is very different than the West Coast. We're shallow. So, a lot of folks can just throw their anchors out and it's fine. I don't know that you would have that out there. I mean, you could still probably drop your anchor and it would slow you down a bit, but I don't know that you're going to touch bottom depending upon where you're at. But yeah, those are definitely considerations as far as, power loss and what are the mitigation strategies? How far would it be if you needed to get tugs out there to assist? Yeah, I would definitely run that through an exercise.
Thank you.
Kelly, what additional issues are introduced on the West Coast when these offshore wind farms might be 40 miles offshore?
Can you say the first part of that question again?
Yeah, just the fact that these floating offshore wind farms might be 40 miles offshore. How does that affect search and rescue that's different than what you've been through on the East Coast where they're closer to shore?
So I did talk to the first district after y'all asked me to speak here to find out like what had happened in the past 7 years. And a lot of their concerns hadn't really come to fruition as far as, search and rescue or things like that. They said it's pretty much standard operations. So the search and rescue that they would do normally for ships or whatever, it hasn't manifested itself distinctly differently in the wind farms. So I would imagine that once the structures are built, so you probably don't have a lot of folks out there. But if you have a vessel and you have a search and rescue and you're 40 miles off, it's not going to be that much different than a search and rescue operation elsewhere. If anything, it might be helpful, like if they have a vessel that's out there 24/7 that has hospital capability, so they could be a good partner in that instance. They might have, helicopters that are out flying around. That's what we see down here in the Gulf of Mexico is, a lot of times before you even launch somebody to go do a search and rescue case, somebody else is already there helping them out because there's just so much so much going on in the Gulf between the vessels and the helicopters.
You're good, Brian?
Thanks so much for all of that. We have trying to do our due diligence, do a little bit of literature review. We've seen some of the stuff that I suspect you spent a lot of time in with regard to European experience with search and rescue. And I think one of the findings that I wanted to ask you about is that a lot of the search and rescue the Europeans have seen off of their mostly fixed, not floating, but mostly fixed wind farms were actually industrial worker evacuations. Basically falls mostly, but other things like people having heart attacks, because if you got people in the wind farm, they're going to have people problems and they're going to need medical evacuation.
Mm-hmm.
And specifically, what I wanted to ask about was the European experience was that it started out as a high volume search and rescue until the contract services you mentioned were hired, at which point they saw fewer cases, but all of the governmental cases were really nasty ones. And I was wondering, sort of acquiring a higher level of, medical acuity care, that kind of thing. Did you guys talk about how this would shift the business from maybe, man overboard, person in the water, hoists towards more heavy duty medevacs when you're doing that kind of work?
Mm-hmm. We did talk.
Your exercise.
Mm-hmm. We did talk about that. And in fact, they've had some cases up there in the first district. And the companies up there have contracted with their own helicopter companies that are much more capable than ours. When we do search and rescue up there, we always like to tell people we're like a pickup truck, and we're basically throwing you in the back of a pickup truck. We're going to get you to the hospital, but we don't have the same capabilities that some of these really nice medevac helicopters do, which is again why we recommend that they contract, and they have up there. But at the same time, it's not going to end up to where it's like the MSAP policy. Sorry, I remember the acronym. I've been retired too long. That's basically where if you got a recreational boat and they run out of gas, as the Coast Guard, we can't touch them until we know that a commercial entity isn't going to go get them, because we're taking business away from somebody. It's not going to end up like that, because a medevac, it's an emergency, right? If we can get there as the Coast Guard, we are going to get there, and that's what they've done in the first district. They've gotten some pushback from the contractor companies because they're like, "Hey, you're taking business away from us," but they're like, "Look, it's a medical emergency. If they call the Coast Guard first, and we can get out there, we're going to do that." So I know that that's what they've experienced there.
It's great. You kind of chased a little bit of something I was going to ask about, which is these contract supports, just like in the Gulf, where they have similar arrangements you were talking about off the Loop and other places. The Coast Guard is making its decision about whether to launch or not strictly based on who's the best asset to get there the quickest. Is that fair to say?
Mm-hmm.
So it's just another tool in the toolbox, but it has not replaced Coast Guard search and rescue in these wind farms?
That's correct. Yes, but I think what the Coast Guard is trying to make sure that the wind farms understand is and having worked, search and rescue in the first district, they're limited in the amount of helicopters they have. And if you have a busy weekend, I mean, sometimes you have to choose, between somebody that's having a heart attack and somebody that's in the water, based on water time, it sounds terrible, but who's going to die first, and then you send the helicopter to that person. So there's a lot of triage that goes on. And so I think they were open and honest with the companies about that. And it's like, hey, we may or may not be able to, if you've got a heart attack victim or something like that, then, yes, we'll send our helicopter out. But that's kind of where they wanted to communicate with them as far as their own capability and how many search and rescue assets they have, and how busy it can be up there.
Okay, thank you very much, Kelly.
Mm-hmm.
Move on. Final speaker.
Great. Thanks, Kelly. I really got a double hitter here. So We're lucky to have Captain Holly Harrison, who's been retired a grand total of what, 25 days?
Wow.
So she just departed the 13th Coast Guard District, the Chief of Staff. And for folks who don't speak Coast Guard, that position is the admiral in charge of the region's #2. And that carries a lot of weight. So you have to be the acting district commander on many occasions, making all those command level decisions. But you're also sort of as the title implies, chief of staff for the district, including being in charge of the command center and all of the search and rescue and law enforcement case, all of that sort of tactical work that happens, I'm going to say, outside of immediate sectors. So there's some support for the sectors, but the rest of the ocean falls to the district and well beyond just the EEZ. So Holly took that position, capstoning her career of, I think, done just about every job there is doing the Coast Guard, but as a career cutterman in command of our national security cutter out in Hawaii. I think it was your last float command, but just a whole history of operations across the Pacific and other places in the country. And we really wanted to get you on board to talk a little bit about how search and rescue, particularly in the Pacific Northwest, particularly outside of the immediate nearshore environment, is different from, sort of the typical recreational boat, small boat response that we all think of when we think of search and rescue. And particularly with regard to some of the stuff that Kelly was able to set you up with for, ship-based operations, not just related to search and rescue, but really, the whole range of sort of things that the Coast Guard does out there that are related to commercial fishing. So thanks so much for making some time for us today. And with that, I'll turn it over to you.
Okay, I do have some slides and pictures I may go to. If you can skip a couple through into SAR ops. I'll leave these so they have some additional details, so I'm definitely not reading these slides, but keep clicking a couple through, keep going. So let me stop here, for example. This is the Pacific Northwest, the District 13 region. You'll notice on the right-hand side of the screen, you see all these little circles. This is where we put all of our assets trying to pre-stage for search and rescue. We take a look at the entire region. Who's operating out in the water? What types of vessels? When are they operating? What are they doing out there? What do we have? What capabilities do those assets have? And we basically try and figure out how to put these assets to where it makes the most sense so we can respond to wherever and whatever we need to do throughout the district. We can never predict every scenario. It's like your local fire department tries to strategically place the fire stations so that they are best posed to respond. But you'll notice for our range rings there, that's a 90-minute response time with both small boats and helicopters. That gets you, that slide on the right is about 200 miles offshore, but it goes far further than that for our responsibilities. There are big things hanging out in the ocean. Fishermen, you gotta talk about some of the offshore species like fishing for tuna. They are way offshore, outside the range of our small boats and even our helicopters, which gets challenging because if lives are in danger, you can't get them off via air. You can't get them off via our smaller boats. You got to send something big out there to get them. And the other challenge with that is we don't have a lot of ships spread everywhere. We have a lot of small boats close to the shore, not so many out in the ocean, particularly here in the Pacific Northwest and Northern California. We do have some down towards Southern California, more focused on the southern border that could be repurposed for search and rescue if need be. But there are whole vast swaths of the ocean up here that there's nothing offshore. Something would have to be dispatched to go out there. When we talk ships, that takes days sometimes to get out there. We do rely heavily on other vessels out there. We have a program, an AMVER program. It's basically volunteer vessels who we can tap in an emergency and request them as good Samaritans to help. They don't have training, for example, towing. A lot of times they'll do the best they can, but you kind of get what you get with that. So offshore becomes infinitely harder. The further you go offshore, the harder it gets is really the big takeaway, and the fewer options you have in terms of our assets, but other assets as well. So go to the next slide. Kelly mentions, we talked about search and rescue readiness. A lot of things factor into this. She talked about, what assets do we have? We don't have a lot. Up here in the Pacific Northwest, in that second big bullet for the extreme environment, Anyone who lives up here knows we get some extreme weather, particularly in the winter months. Once you get north of San Francisco, most of the ports have breaking bars with surf in the wintertime. Even some of our small cutters and even medium endurance, mid-size, 200 plus when we had them, couldn't get through breaking surf. So if it's not already out there, it's not crossing that bar. It is going to be trapped in port. So if you don't get it out there ahead of, say, a storm coming in, you're on your luck. You're out of luck. Flying for the helicopter pilots, you get fog, extreme winds. We had a storm last season. If we've been to Florida, they've given it a name and called it hurricane fill in the blank. Here in the Pacific Northwest, it's just called winter. We also don't have heavy weather tow capability anymore with our surf capable boats, the ones that can get through the bars. We had these old 52 just quick workhorses. They're old. We've retired them. We haven't replaced them. So our primary surf boats, they can go out and tow, but only up to a certain tonnage. And after that, if the vessel's too heavy or the vessel plus the catch is too heavy, they may not be able to tow that vessel. So I'm not going to touch so much on aviation because my understanding you got to speak from the great Captain Scott Jackson on all things aviation. So I'm sure he filled you in on all that. So next slide. We talked about the search. Kelly talked a little bit about this. I'm not going to go into all the details. Bottom line, we collect a whole bunch of information to figure out, who's the call, where are they, what do we know about the vessel, the people, the conditions, the weather, everything. Keep going. And then we pile it all into SAR ops. All these variables go in. But as you can imagine, your data's only, your outcome's only as good as the data going in. So anything we can do to get accurate on-scene information is important. So for example, dropping the data buoy. We know what the predicted open ocean currents are, but when you put, say, structures in the middle of the ocean, that's the information we need to know. So if there's already a sensor on that structure, great. Or if we need to drop a buoy, somehow we need to know on scene. We can look at windy.com or what the National Weather Service says, but we always ask the folks who's on, what's our on-scene weather? When the first asset gets out there, what are the winds, what are the seas, what's the visibility? Because we need to refine this because there's a lot of assumptions that go into this. And every little one that it's like the cone of a hurricane in Florida. You see that position of the hurricane, 24 hours later, the cone is wider. 48 hours, it's wider because the cone of uncertainty, the more variables you add in, the more uncertainty you have, which makes showing up on scene to search more difficult. So continuing on. So search challenges, a lot of this, how accurately do we know the knowledge to the area? Again, on-scene weather, if we have information about the area, knowing where those, say, fixed structures are. Fixed structures are infinitely easier for me to deal with than something that's tethered or not permanently mounted. I can nose up and get pretty close to, say, a bridge because that bridge is not moving. A buoy on a large scope of chain that could be swinging depending on the currents, I'm going to give that more room with a ship just because I don't know exactly where it is as it's moving. So anything that's tethered and could swing or move is going to prevent me from getting closer to it. Skipping through, I'm trying to get to some pictures here. As far as types of, right there, types of assistance, you're going to get pretty much three types. We're either going to on scene, either say hoist a member of our crew down from a helicopter, or I'm going to launch a small boat from a ship and go over to your vessel if I can get people on safely. And we might assist you, render medical aid, deliver some pumps, try and help you dewater the fishing vessel, and hopefully solve the problem, and then the vessel can make its way into port. If we can't solve it at that low level, we really have two options. Get the people off the boat. If there's something, say the boat's disabled, it's unseaworthy, it's sinking, they have a medevac and we just need to get them off. Or if we can, the vessel and the crew. And that involves towing the vessel. And you got to do that with a ship. That is tricky. And I'm going to show you some pictures of towing on a good day. Hopefully help you understand that. So let me skip forward. Next one. Offshore, these are some of my notes as I was putting this together. Again, just anytime you're thinking about ships, the larger the vessel, the more standoff distance you need from hazards. Anything, bridges, buoys, shoal water, we're going to need more distance from that because even if we think we're sitting still in the water is moving. And so we have to account for that. And even though you might think it's 4 knots, well, it might be 3.9, then it's 4.2, then it's 4.1. It's not static. So we want to give ourselves wiggle room. I want to know how accurately I can predict where that position is. I also want to know clearances ahead. You said a large ship out, got a tall mast. What's ahead? What's overhead? So I don't know how low these turbine blades come or structures, but I'm also thinking about that. Closer I get to a hazard to navigation, the more of my crew has to focus on us not ending up on that hazard, because then we become a search and rescue. So we do not want to do that, but I have to take more of my crew and my focus to keep the ship safe, which leaves fewer people available to say, conduct a search, pick up a pair of binoculars, look at the radar, things like that. As far as SAR ops, I've been on the receiving end of these search patterns, and I take a look at the search pattern, I put it on my chart, and I go, that's great. Well, there's a structure right there. SAR ops, when he gives me that pattern, I report at the end of it whether I found anything or not. If I don't, it assumes I did that search exactly as planned. So the more I deviate from that plan, it's a variable that goes in. It's information that will add to inaccuracies. So if I can't get close to a structure, or there's too many of them too close and I can't get between them, there's a whole swath I might not be able to search. And there's no real great way for me to give that kind of accurate, this is exactly what I searched, for the system to account for it. So that's a problem when it comes to planning for what's the next search going to look like, and the search after that. And the further, if I can't sail close to the search, these search widths are depending on what's the target. If I am looking for a vessel, a 200-foot, or say a cruise ship, I don't have to get too close to a cruise ship to find a cruise ship in the middle of the ocean. You can put those search legs 10 miles apart, 5 miles apart. It's going to be easy. If I'm looking for a person in the water, those legs are going to have to be very tight and very close. And so if I can't get close, anything I can't get close to is a swath of the ocean, we're not searching, and I could miss something. So depends on what we're looking for. Any objects that are higher than my radar will block my radar. So my ability to search for ships and vessels, there's a bunch of structures out there that's going to clutter my radar screen with a bunch of dots. And then behind them will be these blank voids. That's just a challenge for radar in general, as well as if I'm using other sensors. And then when you talk about the weather that drives everything in terms of the wind, the seas, and the current. That tells me what I can and can't do, and I can't control it. So the only thing I can do is adapt to the weather conditions. And so when you're talking about ships, we can go to the next picture. So I want to talk about two main ways that we can help from ships. So I get on scene. This is my disabled vessel. This is actually a training evolution. If you'll notice, it's a glorious blue day, calm seas. Every search and rescue case is this easy, night, middle of the afternoon. We're doing training here. So please, imagine this at night. The seas are just all churned up. Both vessels are just getting tossed left and right. The crew on board that vessel is seasick and unable to help hook up the tow. So this gets infinitely, in many ways, worse. But not to go into too much, but bottom line, I'm gonna have to get pretty close to that vessel because I've got to get a line over to it. Now, if I'm using two small boats, like some of the ones you might see out here, they can get pretty close to each other and toss over a line. That's pretty easy. The bigger you get with the ships and the vessels, again, you need to stand off distance with each other because you're bouncing around and you don't want to hit each other. And so here we're using a line throwing gun. We have an M16 or a shotgun to basically shoot a line over to the vessel. But if it's windy and you'll see it, you can't even see the line. It's so thin. It's thinner than the cord, than these laptop cords, thinner than that. If you're shooting a line, a couple, 100 yards, the wind's going to take that and blow that. So to try and hit that target, that gunner's mate or whoever's shooting it, it's got to aim upwind to the side. There's definitely an art to this. It's very hard. So guess what? You may not hit it the first time, second time, the third time. It is hard to hit a target like that. So next slide. So they're shooting, this is just next slide. You can't even see it. There's actually a line going over in the slide. I'll leave the pictures. You guys can zoom in and just see how fine that line is. So next slide, you shoot the line over. The crew on that vessel gets the line. Next slide. And then they have to start heaving it aboard. It starts with a very thin line that we shoot over. We attach it to what we call a messenger, a graduated messenger. The next the diameter starts to increase as it goes. So you'll see this line, you can actually see it. It's a little bit thicker. That might be something, half-inch line, something like that. As they keep pulling and pulling and pulling, then the line will get thicker. Now it might be an inch thick, and keep pulling and pulling. And then now you're going to eventually get the tow line on board. It's a lot of time and a lot of pulling. And by the way, these folks can be exhausted, seasick, and the boat's getting pitched around. They're trying to not get pitched overboard while they're trying to do this. Next slide. On board our ships, you can see we have line kind of faked out on deck. And we have everyone's watching to see how much line is in the water, because you have to be very careful and coordinated. If you just dump all the line in the water, you could get it fouled around your screws, and now you have 2 ships in distress. I speak from someone who has done this. Have to be very careful about it. So this is not a quick evolution, and you go at the pace of the people being rescued. However fast they haul around is however fast you can pay out the line. You cannot shove more line to them. Next slide. Meanwhile, the ships are dead in the water. They're just drifting. They're just whatever the oceans and currents are doing. So before you even start this evolution, you have to look downwind, down current, depending on what variables are affecting you more, the wind, the current, both in some way. Make sure you're clear, because you need room. You cannot be maneuvering while you do this. So as you start to pay out, you can see down there on the lower left, more of our tow line. In our case, we tied some fenders to it just to keep it on the surface. It's a training evolution, just we have new folks, want to make sure no issues. We still have more line to pay out. Keep going. Slide. And then once you finally get everything set up and you get all the tow line out, they'll put the tow line out and attach it to the nose of their vessel. And then we will have to set the distance. In open ocean and heavy seas, you have to tow at a very long distance. That line is not very thick. Imagine big ships. It's like a rubber band. You're going to stretch it depending on the seas my ship is in and the seas another ship is in, even, 50 yards away, 100 yards away. They might be going down up over the crest of a wave while the other vessel's coming down the backside of the wave. So the line can get pulled and stretched back and forth. And if you pull it too hard, you can snap it, and then you're really out of luck. So it's tricky. You have to go do it slow. And then how you pick up speed. You just don't at this point just, okay, all ahead. You can't do it. You have to slowly work it up. You have to turn slowly with vessels under tow. So all of this just requires room. So for me as a cutterman, when we talk about spacing, if you're going to talk about big ships offshore that I might have to go into with a ship to rescue, I'm going to want it and need as much room as I can. I would always ask for that because that just gives me maximum flexibility. There may be times I see a vessel in distress and go, sorry, I can't get in there to tow you. I'm going to have to wait till you drift through that field, come out on the other end. And that's where we're going to have conversations about, will they come off their vessel? And sometimes fishermen do not want to lose their vessels. They will ride it out. And that's a challenge. Next slide. This is just us hauling in the tow line. It's a very labor intensive evolution to do towing. Up here on the West Coast, we don't have a lot of options. She was mentioning salvage tugs on the East Coast. Maybe down in LA and San Francisco, you get a lot of mariners out there, just good Samaritans who might help. But you're not going to get the commercial tug companies, readily available. You get north of San Francisco. In fact, there's no Towboat US. There's no others. It is us, the Coast Guard, or ZIP. There are a couple rescue tugs stationed up in the Strait of Juan de Fuca for specific needs, but otherwise, you go down Washington, Oregon, it's the U.S. Coast Guard, or if your Good Samaritan neighbor nearby is willing to help you. That's it. So, next slide. This is just an option. This is just a picture when you get bigger ships. I'll leave the picture so you can take a look. Take a look at the tow line, which you can't even see on the screen in this room. Not a very big tow line. So it's very delicate. The bigger the ships go, nobody carries these massive tow lines. They are a challenge because you go slow and you go steady, because it's almost like one opportunity. And if you put too much power on, think about the tonnage of these vessels. You snap that tow line, you're done. Next slide. The other thing we can do is we can send with ships somebody over to the vessel to, again, get them off. render first aid, deliver a pump to help them control their flooding so that they can make it in safely, things like that. Launching small boats at sea, we do it all the time with the Coast Guard, but I would say that's actually probably one of the most dangerous things we do as cuttermen. We do it all the time, so we make it look easy. But I have also flipped small boats, and I have also done things you're not supposed to do, and it's a very easy way to hurt people. So most of our cutters have what we launch from the side of the vessel. This is an example of what we call a dual point davit, simply because it's just connected at the bow and stern of the boat. But to launch it, we pick it out of its cradle, but you can see it's hanging from the end of these wires. That's not so bad here. If I'm launching this, I don't want to be rolling back and forth because that boat's going to be slamming at the end of the tether. I'd prefer to be heading into the seas and doing more of an up-down motion. Now, I don't want to go straight into the seas because in a minute, I'm going to put that boat in the water. I don't want a ton of swells coming down the side. So there's a sweet spot. I put the weather off the port bow for the wind and seas. It's similar to doing helicopter operations. So depending on which way the wind and seas are, so I can get them off my port bow, that's the direction I've got to go to get this boat down. Launching this process, so we put this boat, next slide, we lower it like this. We've got a team of people on deck. You see that line kind of at an angle going across the screen. We're trying to use manpower to keep the vessel from swinging, but it's all manpower. At the end of the day, that boat weighs but so much. It's going to swing where it wants to swing. Next slide. We put the boat alongside the ship. We snug it up tight, get the crew loaded, and then we actually have to launch it. Next slide. As we launch it, we have to swing it out to get it off the side of the ship and down. At this point in heavy seas, the boat's going to be swinging. This is tough for our crew members. So we have to think, can we launch the boat and do it safely and not hurt our own shipmates doing this? Or even if we can do it, I may not have an injured person in that boat. Am I going to hurt them more putting them in this boat trying to get them back? So these are variables we're thinking about. Once we lower the ship to the boat to the water, next slide. We are now being towed. You got the 2 points to the davit, but there is a line off the bow that leads up forward. We are essentially dragging the boat alongside the ship. We will disconnect the davit, and we're still towing it alongside. And then crew member up forward is going to have to go and release everything. That's a hard job to do if the boat is pitching around. So that's why I don't want to go straight into the seas. If that boat is pitching up and down, this person in the boat really doesn't have much to hold on to as they're trying to use both hands to deal with that thing painted, that ball painted orange and heavy and metal, medicine ball, and you want to get a headache, that'll hurt you. So next slide. This is them just releasing it, and then next slide, away they go. The other option on a few of our newer ships that's not as common is a stern launch. Very easy to launch. Open these doors on the back, pull a pin, and the boat slides out the back. The launch is the easy part. The recovery is the tricky part. Next slide. So when you're trying to come up in here, if this ship is pitching, that stern can be coming out of the water and into the water, out of the water, and or it's doing this, rolling left to right. And our coxswain's trying to thread the needle and time it to get in when it's in this kind of flat, neutral state. There's water surging in and out of there. We had killed someone, one of our own crew members, trying to recover a small boat in this type of situation. This is tricky. So just want to impress upon you kind of what it's like when you're out there. And all the time we're focusing on this. The way I make this safe for my crew, I read the weather, the wind, the seas, the currents, and I position my ship the way they dictate that I need to make it safest. But that means I'm going to have to look on that chart and go, okay, do I have that window, that sea room to do what I need to do? And if there's something in my way, I'm not going to be able to do it. So that could affect how we make decisions about how we get people off of this. Next slide, if we have a couple left here. Just FYI, have you ever seen our surf boats? You can get big ships going pretty nicely in the middle of the ocean. This is only 12 knots of seas going into the seas. So that you can see even a big ship, you can get it flying. It's just you usually don't get to see these pictures because there's not somebody close nearby to take them for you. Next picture, a little dark here. You'll see this is a picture. This is a fishing vessel, and you'll see in this picture, which I'll leave behind. one of our small boats. This is our small boat just trying to make an approach, and you can see it's a couple like click, 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 pictures. How my small boat's up on a wave, it's in the trough. This one's leaning to starboard, this one's leaning to port. This one's you can just see how these vessels ride the dynamic alongside, which is what makes it very difficult approaching these vessels. Next picture. And then the other challenge, there may be some situations we cannot deal with out there. So some vessels I can't tow. If it's taken damage, there's no points for me to hook up and tow. Maybe a moot point. This thing was floating off the Oregon coast recently. It's an overturned, we think, fishing vessel. We don't know where it came from. We don't think it's one of our missing fishing vessels, but this thing's probably 150, 175 feet, steel hull, had an air pocket inside it. Nothing we could do about that. We could wait for it to hit a structure or run aground, or worse, a vessel were to hit that in the middle of the night. So I think that's it for just my perspective on search and rescue. Just a few notes I would piggyback off Kelly. She mentioned lighting on these rigs. Things lit at night are great because it's easy for me to see. That sensor I have is my eyeball. But I would say at night, particularly for our helicopter crews, how they fly, depending on the lighting conditions, they may be flying with night vision goggles. And they're very sensitive. If you just decide, oh, we're going to turn this thing into a giant Christmas tree and put a zillion lights on it so everybody can see it, that could make their rescue actually very hard for them. So that may be one of these things when you talk about during a search and rescue case, when you turn off these turbines, position them a certain way, lighting configurations. I'm not the expert. Talk to our aviators on that. And then the other thing here in the Pacific Northwest, there are a few partners we rely on, even though I said really there's nobody in terms of commercial. We occasionally use Naval Air Station Whidbey, has some H-60s that will help us. Same with some down in San Diego. The U.S. Navy has done hoist-capable aircraft. Whatever we do in terms of exercises, there are backups. We can't fly, or if we're busy doing other cases, and I recommend they be involved, as well as the Canadian Coast Guard. The Canadians are actually pretty good at flying in some extreme weather. And particularly up here in Washington, they have helped us out significantly, not only in terms of the helicopters, but also fixed wing assets. So I would include them on any exercises you're doing as you plan your activities.
Thank you very much. Any questions? Okay, Jeff.
How closely do you work with FAA on sort of parking and lighting? Part of the council.
I couldn't speak for the Coast Guard because I'm not an aviator, so I couldn't even begin to answer that question.
I'm not an aviator either. For each of these facilities, I know on the East Coast, they are very thorough in what they require for the parking and the lighting. So that would be during the planning process, that would be determined.
And I think it's also fair note that the Coast Guard guidance addresses lighting and marking pretty thoroughly. I think this is back to Kelly Benning's work. I think there was an extensive Coast Guard aids to navigation and FAA joint effort on that. So it's pretty, I think it's worked out, but I take Holly's point about night blinding pilots as well.
For us to do a search at night, radar doesn't work well. Most of our electronic sensors don't work real well. Night vision works real well, but you need it to be dark. And once you get night vision, once you flash someone with a white light, it's going to take them another 30 plus minutes to regain their night vision. So particularly if you're looking for a person in the water, that's a very hard subject, hard target to hit. So it's just a variable I would think about, because up here, like Kelly was saying, water temps, the clock is ticking, literally. And so every minute you waste, I don't have 30 minutes to get my crew who's been exposed to white light, or they're dealing with this glare up above, as they're trying to look on the water, but there's this glare. It's just a variable that just will impact the situation. What we can do about it, that's more of a discussion, talk to all the players what it is a factor.
Okay, next question, Robert, and then Mike Thompson.
Yeah, I have a question about sort of installation process. And I know nobody's having to deal with this because we don't have any installed assets, but the concept is they're gonna assemble this in some secluded either port or cove or what have you, and then tow it out to where they want to install it. And I'm just wondering, and maybe you don't have an answer to this, is there any coordination with Coast Guard for that process? Because obviously there's a lot going on, there's tows involved, the lines can break, presumably we're gonna do this in very nice weather, but things.
Our capital ports would be overseeing that, and they would take a look at the situation, what the cargo is, there may be specific requirements to carry certain cargo. I'll give you an example. On the other side, down in Columbia River, we bring in wind turbine blades that get put up in the middle of the country, Chinese-made wind turbine blades. The factor there, and this is working with the pilots as well who are navigating these ships up the river. These ships were being shipped from China and stacked high with these wind turbines. They're trying to, it's expensive, so they want to stack as many as they could. But now our pilots are trying to drive these ships down the Columbia River and can't see. And so we had to get involved and say, you can only put so high, because safety navigation, you need to see and be able to maneuver. And so that would be more of our captain of the ports who would be looking at what the proposed activity is for how they get the.
Okay,
Yeah, hi, thanks. Appreciate the presentation. I've been lucky enough or not to have had to running a couple boats where we had to get folks airlifted off. And I'm just thinking about in an array, how that operation could be impacted. I know there was one occasion where we were well offshore. It was, I'll use the term, not very favorable weather conditions, where it took roughly between the time that the diver was dropped onto the vessel, by the time they put him in the basket and lifted him up, it was a good 2.5, 3 miles, and acknowledging that there's probably not that much space between these turbines to operate like that. Is that something that is you're concerned about, and as a Coast Guard weighed in on that in particular?
I can tell you as a ship driver who launches helicopters. So while you were dealing with a rescue, I have also launched and recovered helicopters. I also can refuel helicopters literally with basically the hose. So the helicopter's flying along with the ship. They drop the hook, pick up the hose, and they fuel while alongside the ship. And we can do that in situations when the landing's really difficult, but you do need that run. You need however much time you need. You do not deviate when you're in the middle of that. So Kelly had mentioned having maybe these lanes that might be available. That doesn't do you any good if it's a disabled vessel. But if you're talking about bringing a swimmer down to deal with a medical emergency, you would hope the vessel, you don't have multiple. I mean, it could be, you could have an explosion with a mechanical, with the medical, it could be a worst case scenario, but presuming the vessel can still maneuver, if there were periodically lanes or wider areas. And you could also take a look at the wind and currents. We kind of know on the West Coast where the prevailing currents are. They're going to run south, not north, for example. So how you position the arrays, kind of these fairways, if there's any leeway for that, you could also kind of pre-plan. We know the currents would push a vessel in this direction, and that could go into the planning process.
Yeah, no, thanks. I appreciate that. I just know keeping the bow into the wind while the helicopter's flying overhead and they're dunking the swimmer into the water is for fun is got to pay attention to that. So thanks, appreciate it. Thanks for all you do or did.
This is kind of a general question. So far, nobody's answered it to my satisfaction. So you mentioned our lovely weather here. And if you go to the meteorology department, you'll encounter a professor named Frank Bass, who describes the Columbus State Storm 1962 as the strongest non-tropical cyclone to hit America since the Pilgrim's Land. So that had winds of, what source you read, up to 170 or 190 mile an hour gusts. And there was another one that I grew up hearing about, 1921 big blow, that had winds up to about 170. So are these structures able to withstand that? And what happens when we get another Columbus State storm? And something has to fail in that intensity of wind, then what happens?
I know from our perspective, once the weather gets that bad, you won't be out there.
No.
And we will also tell mariners, I did this with Superstorm Sandy. It was one of those calm before the storm, glorious calm. I mean, flat day off New England, way out in the Grand Banks. All the fishermen are out there, they're loving it. There's whales jumping, they're just catching fish left and right. And we are out there telling them, you need to get into port. And they're like, it's glorious, and we're catching all these fish, this is wonderful. The Canadians are flying, broadcasting over Channel 16, get into port, get into port. And it got to the point where we literally had to say, okay, if they wouldn't leave, what do you want us to, what's your spouse's phone number, and what message do you want us to tell them when you die out here? Because we are not coming for you, given the predicted sea state, which was like 40 to 45 feet. And so there's no rescue in those scenarios. And then afterwards, it's what breaks loose, what's the damage, what's adrift, what washes up on the beaches, what oils.
Does the Coast Guard have any authority then in certifying those structures? Who does that? Who certifies it? So we don't have piles and piles of fiberglass, Chinese fiberglass blades.
Yeah, that is not the Coast Guard from a regulatory standpoint.
There are international entities that certify to various hurricane strength and so. I mean, we are putting wind turbines, offshore wind turbines off Taiwan and off China where, they have cyclones. Again, on everything on the coast. It doesn't mean that some blades won't break. So this wasn't offshore, but on land when Maria came through in Puerto Rico, there was one wind project that got somewhat, was sort of destroyed, and another one that was completely spared. So not unlike tornadoes that come through, and but
they're not designed for much.
And it will happen again. I mean, it's happened twice in 100 years.
Yeah.
So you'll see the end.
So
we for another one. Big wow. Columbus Day storm. I was like young high school age. They let us out of school early. This is down in Battleground, part of Vancouver. And there was this utterly black dead calm, no birds chirping or anything. And it was like, wow, this is spooky. And then the wind started.
Yeah.
Holly, just not as much as I love search and rescue. I'm gonna ask you a question, kind of take you off onto a different mission area, and we're trying to think about all of the different things the Coast Guard does that affect not just wind energy areas, but particularly commercial fishermen and operating in and around, as we've been talking about search and rescue. Down in the Gulf, the district commander, given all of the installations there, created an offshore area maritime security committee with the concerns they had about the oil and gas industry and potential for security. They also have an offshore advisory committee that is more concerned with safety and industrial incidents. I did not hear Kelly talk about whether they had decided to do that, but I think that has not been done on the East Coast. And I wonder if there's been any discussion on the West Coast about whether such a thing would be formed for the wind energy areas. And specifically, given the Coast Guard's ports, waterways, and coastal security, maritime domain awareness, and all of the sort of tracking of things beyond the immediate coastline, how do you see that being affected by wind energy areas? And so what's the status of play there?
I have not been involved in the wind development here, so I can't tell you what is happening. I have not heard anything about this. So I don't know if that's because I'm just not in the loop or there hasn't been conversation. I will say we do have the security committees here in the Pacific Northwest within the ports, and our captain of the ports do use them. They meet regularly, and it could be on any subject that falls under their purview. They're really good for if something is happening, one partner can get the word out to everybody else. Sometimes it's just informational, sometimes it's a, hey, something's going on and it will affect you. I need everyone to know, or we need you to come and participate. So it's kind of that goes back to having the accurate phone numbers. The joke is you don't want to be on the scene of the oil spill or the incident exchanging business cards because you're meeting this person for the first time. So if you had these committees of the stakeholders together, I will say this, the fishing community, particularly here in the Pacific Northwest, they are very vocal and they know how to get and tap into their local senators, congressmen, all those folks, the media. There is a couple of groups with just the spouses associations are very powerful, and you don't invite them in on the get-go, they're gonna work against you. So better them work with you than against you. And because there's gonna be a lot of concern about this, there's gonna be a lot of concerns about lost livelihoods, anything that we do here, in fact, that could possibly affect safety for fishermen. When they find out about it, they immediately go, what? And it really gets them spun up. So to help debunk any myths or rumors, these committees, at least in this region, have proven to be very valuable across the board for all number of things. So I'm a big fan of them for synthetic.
Can I chime in on that one?
Sure.
Can y'all hear me?
Yes.
Yes, go ahead.
Great. Okay. That was one of the things that we looked at a while ago, and one of the recommendations was made to put it at the area level potentially. So down in the Gulf of Mexico, what we have at the district level is it's OCS, OCMI, basically. It's one for all four sectors, and that was to help with consistency. OCMI is the officer in charge of marine inspections, and of course OCS outer continental shelf. So we were looking at that model up in D1 at the time to see if we wanted to do something like that. But, then when we looked at where the wind energy was going, it was, throughout multiple districts. But it was going to be so very different on the West Coast than it is on the East Coast with what you guys are looking at with the floating platforms and, all the stuff that Holly already talked about. So, I think our recommendation at the time was to maybe, if you get to the point that you need that for consistency purposes, look at putting it a position at the area to cover the multiple districts to help with the consistency. But I'm not sure that they've gotten to that point yet, but that was something that we had looked at.
Great, thank you, Kelly.
Okay, any other questions? Seeing none, do you want to wrap it up, Brian? Any comment?
Yeah, so we're lucky to have had, I think, the breadth of Coast Guard experience with operations on the West Coast, and we tried to point those at folks who both understood sort of the operational principles, Kelly's command center view, but also had actually sailed these waters and had, so to speak, dirt under their fingernails. We heard from aviation, we heard from the small boat community, we heard from the cutterman community, and we heard from the command center community. So I can't thank you all enough for rounding out our experience here. I guess what I would leave the committee with is the opportunity just to ask if you have anything you'd like to close out with that you would ask us to bear in mind when we think about how operations will change as wind energy areas come online, if they ever do. I mean, so nobody knows what direction this will take or how long, but one of the things the committee has heard over and over again is that based on state level goals, just for example, in California, we could be looking at 5 times as much wind energy as has already been leased. And we're trying to, as a committee, kind of wrap our minds around what that would mean for Coast Guard operations. And I just offer actually all three of you the opportunity, if there's anything you'd like to leave us with on that.
I would just say, from my perspective as a cutterman and search and rescue operations, the more structures you put in the ocean, I don't care what they are, those are the more obstacles that we're going to have to work around. Some cases, there may be opportunities to put a sensor or add a capability, but a lot of times it's going to cause problems for the way we do business. So if we can't find a new way to do business, adapt to it, we just need to think this through, because like the pictures I showed you, those days are easy, not a problem. So you're gonna have all these vessels, like Kelly was saying, locals go out, they take care of it, their contracted folks carry it, it's easy, or like, over in Europe. But when it gets bad, that's where these obstacles make things very, very, very difficult. So, think about your worst case scenario and what level of risk are you willing to take, to potentially kill fishermen or be unable to retrieve their vessels, or just any other vessel? What level of risk you're willing to take? There will always be those 100-year storms, but how safe or how reckless do you want to be? And we should go in it with our eyes wide open.
Yeah, I would say there's the potential that Coast Guard will also say, can't go into the wind farms, we can't operate helicopters in there, and we can't operate our cutters in there, just because the risk is too great. We just saw the proposals from the developers, I think it was down off of Humboldt, of the underwater anchoring systems that they're proposing, and it's gonna be a spider's web down there, and any fishing vessel that's dragging gear through that area is taking significant risk of getting their gear caught up and causing additional issues for those vessels. So it's definitely a vastly different environment and significantly more risks. And then, like we talked about, if those structures go down, we got a 1,000-foot structure that is now a hazard to navigation in the waterway and washing up on beaches. And yeah, we've had containers and we've had turtle vessels in the waterways, but that'll be a whole different level of risk I think we're dealing with. Oh, and like you said, that there's been 2 decades worth of discussion in the Pacific Northwest of trying to develop something like this, and our constant question to them is, do you understand the environmental conditions you plan on putting these pieces of equipment in, and are they going to be able to survive? And obviously that's an engineering and environmental question. But yeah, I don't think they're really getting a good answer at this point. Very good.
Kelly, any parting shots?
Yes, again, thanks for the opportunity to talk with you all. I think you do have a lot to think about out there. I think it's a little bit easier with the fixed structures, and then they're in the seabed. So a lot to look at, but I think just the principles of emergency management are sound no matter what you're looking at. So, communicate early and often, look at things by a case basis. You got to look at all the risks, and then look at preparedness strategies and mitigation strategies. And that's really all you can do, on the front end. And then on the back end, then it's just your response strategies. And again, a good exercise program, and just working with all parties to make sure that you have the best outcome possible.
Thank you all. That finishes our public presentations. We do have time for a public comment period. Carolyn, do you want to take one?
Yes, thank you again to all of our speakers over the last 2 days, but now, if there's anyone that's joining us public, we do have about a half an hour to take comments. I just ask that if anybody is gonna share comments, that they are related to our statement of task. I put in the chat a link to our public website. The description of the website is the task for our committee. So we'll open the floor now, see if anyone that's joining us online would like to raise your hand or put a comment in the chat. We have a really quiet online audience again today. I'll give it a few more minutes if people want to join, just kind of going again over the statement of task for the project that Michelle talked about yesterday when we started, that we are looking at the historic and current uses of offshore areas on the West Coast, and then offshore California, Oregon, and Washington. And also, we've heard today several Coast Guard presentations were charged with analyzing Coast Guard operations related to commercial fishing activities. We're also looking at anticipated interactions with adverse impacts on maritime activities with the placement of renewable energy infrastructure, anticipated and substantial benefits and methods to mitigate adverse impacts through design, siting, and maintenance operations. And then finally, the committee will be looking at the decision-making process and for offshore wind off the West Coast and outlining recommendations for government consideration on impacted coastal communities, tribal governments, fishing communities in particular, and making sure that appropriate governmental considerations of potential benefits of offshore wind are thought about, as well as risk reduction and mitigation of adverse impacts for safety at sea and search and rescue, Coast Guard operations related to commercial fishing activities. All right, so seeing no public comment. No, we do, awesome, all right.
Which, I had thoughts, from a period of things thinking after, can send relative recent comments to you in writing later?
Yes, absolutely, yes. My email is on the website that I put in the link in the chat. Comments can come, directly to me, or there is a comment button on our website as well. So all of those comments come to National Academy staff to those for the study. But absolutely, definitely, if there's anything that people are thinking about after the event, things really like to hear from the communities that are engaged in this process. Also, I'll note that recordings of the presentation and slideshows will be posted. Those do take a couple of days, so probably sometime next week we'll have everything available on the event webpage. If there was something that you missed and want to go back to, that is on our website.
Okay, with that, why don't we take a 10-minute break and we'll resume with closed session.
Thank you all for joining us online for open portion. This closes the on stage.